Okay, yeah, good. All right, we'll call the meeting to order. First order of business will be approving the February 3rd meeting minutes. Anybody have any corrections to make?
No corrections. I move to approve the meeting note.
Have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Anybody on for public comment?
We don't have anyone for public comment unless there's anyone in the crowd that would like to give.
All right. The first discussion item will be the transportation fee.
Hi, I'm not sure what's going on today, but I can't turn my video on. This is Tierney, by the way. Hello. You should be able to know.
All right, you ready?
Yes, thank you.
So good afternoon, Russ Grayson, Chief Operations Officer. I'm here with.
Sarah Hudson, Senior Policy Analyst.
So this is the next round of discussions around phase 2 of the transportation fee. Just building on our last conversation, I'll give you a kind of a high level overview of what we're doing. So Sarah's going to go over just a kind of a quick rundown of, again, how we got to this point. If you remember last time we were talking about using business registration information to get to kind of a type of use, linking that to a trip generation, and then put that into the model to come up with the fees. Well, we've done that. And what we're going to do is give you the first run of that model and try to go through how we got there, the relationships between how this model works. And we're also going to show you how the fee structure was popping out, and then some sample cost to certain accounts, different types of uses in the community, so you can get an idea. This is not the final recommendation. It's really more of trying to make sure you understand how the dials and levers work on this and how you would like us to approach this. We do have some questions to prompt around that, with the idea that we'd be coming back to you in 2 weeks with kind of that recommended model run. The idea is we're also going to go through some of the policy points as well. And the plan is to have Sarah will be working on a document which is basically kind of a policy recommendation document that BDAP can edit or adopt or tell us to move forward with the recommendation to council with. But we want to draft that up so you have something to work from as we go through that. But before we do that, we want to use today just to make sure that we're kind of in tune with what we're trying to do. And again, so with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah, and she can kind of go through what we've done and how we got to this point, and then we'll start talking through the data.
All right, so in terms of kind of the recommendations that have come out of these meetings to date, just to kind of cover, these are the things we discussed, and then I know we have a few more items to work through. But the big thing from last meeting was the overarching decision. Let's not recommend discounts or exemptions in phase 2, although the group did say they wanted to hear kind of ongoing updates of what the impact is specifically to childcare and affordable housing, how this fee is impacting those groups, and what other work is kind of being done to kind of help address kind of the cost issues that those groups face. And then the other ones are a little bit smaller, but just a reminder, we kind of talked about expanding the short-term rental supplement to all types of short-term rentals. That was kind of earlier on, but right now we only charge like a supplemental fee, $100 a year for short-term rentals that operate as like a whole house rental. But there are other types of STRs in the city. So maybe someone does it where they rent a room or part of the house, different types of license structures. So the recommendation was to also have a supplemental fee, but calibrated to kind of recognizing it wasn't a whole house rental for those uses. And then special unit classes, there's a few types of businesses that don't operate well in charging them on a square footage basis. So the group kind of generally was said we'd follow kind of staff recommendation there. So that just includes a few other uses that aren't currently in the phase 1. So that would be like golf courses per hole, gas stations per fueling position. So I'll show what those rates look like, but it was just a slight expansion of what we currently do. As a reminder, in phase 1, we currently charge hotels, motels by room, schools by student. So those are things that are already accounted for. And I know you've seen this slide before, so it's just, I'll go through it quickly, but it's like, how do we kind of baseline kind of what we're talking about that we're going to be showing you today? So again, our city business registration captures what type of business use is happening through NAICS data. That NAICS data is then linked to ITE manual data, so we know what that trip generation is, what that impact is on the system. We're grouping ITE land use classification. So I'm going to show you a graph in the next slide of like how that data gets grouped together, because we're starting to form that bin structure, which we're going to be walking through in a lot of detail today. And this is all getting linked to the non-residential utility account. We already have square footage on that account. That's how we charge AS1. So again, that business use is layered on top of square footage, and all of that results in what the non-residential monthly transportation fee. So it's that bin rate that we'll talk about times 1,000 per 1,000 square feet. And then I know we showed this last time too, so I'll just go through it quickly. But again, that kind of NAICS data from the business registration to ITE, it's not a one-to-one exercise. There's a lot more NAICS code assignments than ITE. So this is just kind of an example of how it all kind of gets collapsed. You might have a very granular like lawyer office, but that becomes general office. So just a reminder of how that kind of relationship works, and that we still fully expect and plan to have our appeals process available for when customers feel like they're not being grouped in the right bin based on those categories. Okay, so we're gonna get into like kind of these initial, I feel like there's gonna be a lot of like preliminary slides just so we can all know what kind of assumptions we're working with. So I'm going to walk through those in the next few slides before we actually kind of show the numbers. So as we've talked about here, we need to increase compliance in business registrations to get more of that NAICS data. We currently have about 40% of non-residential utility accounts that are not associated with an active business registration. So that's why we have communications kind of ongoing, really going to be doing a lot starting this week to get that communication out to have folks register. But we did a few things on the back end for rate modeling purposes, just so that the numbers that we're showing today and talking through are more in the ballpark. So we included in our rate modeling inactive business registration information. And we also use some commercial real estate analytics, like third-party data, to kind of understand and contextualize some of the data we're seeing. So we did some things from a rate modeling purpose to try to like reduce as much noise in the modeling as we could. And with that additional data work, what you're going to see today represents about 80% of accounts. So we're able to kind of have this fuller picture that we feel more confident sharing that information because of additional data work we did. Like, I think I'll have like notes all over the place, like interpret these initial estimates with caution. So the numbers will shift, they will change, but they really provide that ballpark of like what the relationship is between the bins, what we're kind of talking about in terms of rate. So I just don't want anyone to get too attached to that one number because the number will change, but
I
yeah.
won't grill you on it. But can you explain a little bit more about the inactive business registration information? Where does that come from?
So maybe a business registered like years ago through our business registration program.
Okay.
So we kind of were like, okay, in lieu of not having any data, we'll take what the most recent data was associated with that address, because maybe the use was more or less
Okay.
the same. So that's why it's not, that's why there's like these caveats
So
of like,
point they were registered, but it may not be up to date.
Yeah, and so one of the questions we'll be asking you just to be thinking about is, how do we want to increase the compliance on the business registrations to get that number up from 40%? And the main question is going to be, what bin do we assign them to try to gain not only accurate model information, but compliance at the same time?
This, business registrations are on an annual basis, just for reference.
Would any of those be, because it's tied to an address too, so could it be like a business that's no longer active and it's
Yeah.
a, you know, a
Change
closed
over of tenant, that kind of
business
thing.
type of thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
But we feel confident with the work the team's done, that we've got enough of a foundation to represent numbers that are representative of what's going on in the market and associated fees.
Okay, and then in terms, we're gonna show you a structure that has 6 bins. And in terms of how those bins were set, like kind of where they were. Gonna show you a graph, but we're really looking at the square foot distribution, so total commercial square foot by trip rate, so that ITE data. And then where are those breakpoints kind of naturally occurring in the data? There's also factoring in like grouping similar uses together, like these are office uses, these are kind of manufacturing or warehouse. So there's kind of an intuitive, the uses that kind of operate more similarly. We also had a number of mixed business use considerations. So I'm going to kind of go through that in just a few slides, but there was a lot there because there's not always just one thing happening on an account. Like in many cases, we had folks putting multiple makes codes. So how did we treat that? So I'm going to talk through that. We're also looking where there's solid data availability. Where does ITE have really good data? Where is it a little weaker? Kind of thinking about that, where you set the breakpoints as well. And then with all that benchmarking we kind of did earlier this year, looking at how other cities are approaching this too, as general, like kind of a gut check of where those breakpoints are set. And then here is a graph that shows that trip rate distribution and how the uses are grouped. And at the top, we kind of note what is been put in each bin for the purposes of this exercise and discussion. And then that percentage shows of the commercial square foot, how much of it falls in that bin. Because that's also a consideration of trying to have some evenness. It's not going to be kind of a perfect exercise. But you see that the higher square footage uses, so where a lot of the square footage is occurring, is in kind of those buckets definitely bucket 1, but buckets 1 to 3 have a lot of high square foot uses. And then when you get to bins 5 and 6, it's that higher trip rate, but kind of lower square foot. So you're kind of starting to see that relationship. This graph is also showing what are the uses that are kind of falling in each bucket. And in a few slides, I'll go into even more uses, but it's just kind of giving a snapshot. So you see manufacturing, warehouse storage, industrial, that's in that bin 1 where it's a lower trip rate, higher square foot. And then on the flip side, like if you look all the way to bin 6, you're seeing convenience store, fast food, liquor store. These are things that tend to generate a lot of average daily trips.
One thing I just want you to notice on the horizontal axis is that's the trip rate coming out of the IT manual associated with those uses. The main thing to understand there is it's not a linear relationship. It kind of goes exponential as you move up the bins in terms of the amount of trips that these types of uses generate. So even bin 1 goes from 0 to 7, but when you get up to bin 6, you're going from 107 to 300 trips per day. It's not a linear relationship on when you see the numbers, the higher bins are going to be assigned a higher number of impact. Yes.
So we reviewed this with the chamber, and I realized that this is not easy to absorb, right? Because a lot of people were confused by this. If I were to look at this, I think I'm looking at 5 or 6 bell curves. Is that correct? Is that
basically the distribution of the square footage. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, well, actually, I was thinking that it's more of a distribution around the trip rate correlating to the
square footage.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if that's the case, then that would also mean that the yellow highlights is also it's not just categorization, it's a statistical break that represents the categorization. Right?
It's a combination of both. You're right. We're trying to figure out like where do you logically put in like retail or office, and there's a band of that. So what our consultants did was looked at all the data points and say, well, where does it make sense? Not only from just how the bell curve of the graphs are going, but also use types to get associated uses kind of lumped together. That was from our consultants and from a staff perspective, this made the most sense when we started looking at the distributions of the types of uses that we were putting together as well, to try to make sure, because when you communicate, it's trying to like, you're like, oh, we're linking all manufacturing and warehouse and industrial on one side of the table, right? And then we're trying to put all the office in together, and then you've got medical office and then kind of your higher end retail as you move to the right.
Because this statistical the distribution then is actually going to feed into the discussion around what's equitable in a second, right? Because we're going to start talking about that, but like, in some ways, it feels like we're in a second, we're going to move away from that statistical distribution and.
Yeah, I would say let's go through a couple more slides because this is I just want to make sure everyone understands like this is what we looked at to get to the buckets and the rate. And again, we're not saying this is the final answer. This is just what we did for phase one. Because I think even from a staff recommendation, we saw some things that we want to highlight as well in terms of like, yeah, I think we want to tweak that a little bit, but let's run through the whole thing so you can understand how it all relates to each other.
It's fair to say right now that this does represent statistical distribution around chip rates correlating to square footage.
Yes. Cool. Yep. Exactly.
And so in terms of what kind of the numbers that we will show you, some kind of initial modeling assumptions. So what kind of went into the back end to kind of get what we'll be talking through. So revenue allocations are the same as phase one, carrying that forward, where 53% of the total revenue generation is from the residential accounts and 47% is from non-residential. So it kind of means we know the end part of the equation. Of a $10 million annual revenue generation, we know $4.7 million of that, so 47% is coming from non-residential accounts. Now we're kind of talking about how do we squeeze the balloon in different ways. So having that really data-driven approach to how we get there, but there's some like policy considerations of what does that look like to get to that kind of end part of the equation. Of the 6 bins, so we have 6 bins and they're set at different parts of a trip range. So, so we'll kind of talk through, but bin 1 is like 0 to 8 trips. We set it at the high end of the trip range. This is where I feel like you can get into the weeds really fast, but there's kind of like levers you can pull to kind of how you squeeze the balloon. So we set bin 1 at the high end of the trip range, the middle bins to a weighted average, and bin 6, that like really high bin, to the low end of the trip range. I think the headline there is the reason we kind of made these modeling assumptions is we're trying to soften the impact that happens on the high end of the trip so that a convenience store or someone who's in bin 6, there's a range of what they could be charged in this bin structure, but by setting some of the back end assumptions in the model, it's like distributing that cost down to the lower bins, kind of having the lower bins absorb some of that cost. And I think it's going to be a little bit clearer when we show the numbers.
And bin 1 was set up, you'll see why bin 1 was set at the high end of that was to kind of get it as close as we could to what they're paying now on the existing fee structure. Again, we can adjust these, but just for the example of how the model works, this is how we calibrate it. So again, let's get through all this and then we can kind of go, do we like this? Do we not like this?
Good. I know we're saying we're going to get to it, but I just want to say, because there's an alternative to that, which we could have used, again, using statistical distribution, we could have used a mean or a mode, but we wanted, something happened when we tried to look at it mean or mode. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we looked at, do we use just the average of within each bin? Do we use the weighted average? There's a lot of different ways. Some of it moves the dial significantly, some of it moves it in a minor fashion,
Okay.
so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Other assumptions just in the model is that for those unidentified accounts where we don't have any data, as a way to make sure we have adequate revenue recovery in the model, kind of making conservative estimate, we just kind of put an assumption in the model that when we hear from them, they'll all say they're in the lowest bin. So that might not actually be the case, but that's a way of having a little bit more of a conservative estimate built into the model. So that when we come back later, hopefully we're not showing you numbers that are much higher. Like if anything, it's kind of in that ballpark or lower. Mixed use, I'll kind of run through in just a moment of what those assumptions were. There's also some growth and inflationary assumptions in the model. So we're assuming 1.5% residential growth on an annual basis and 1% non-residential growth, a 2.5% inflationary adjustment. There's also an assumption that 5% of the square footage here, like customers will appeal and say, I'm actually in a lower bin. And just again, a reminder that there's still some ongoing data like tax lot, account information, cleaning happening. So these numbers will shift, but like we're still providing that general ballpark. And if you want to go to the next slide, we have a number of approaches in here about how we're treating mixed business use. So 40% of the total non-residential square foot in the model is attributable to mixed business use, which means there's multiple types of business uses happening on the account. We know that because someone said they had like at least 2 NAICS codes, sometimes up to 5 or 6, just a lot of different things going on. Some of them were pretty straightforward assignments of how we link the NAICS data ITE. So if they said all of these things have like kind of the same root code and we're like, oh, these are all manufacturing uses, they were put in the manufacturing bin, pretty straightforward. Sometimes there's like a lot of different types of varying impact uses happening on account. So maybe you have a restaurant next to an office or retail next to industrial. So that's where we had to make some modeling decisions of where to place those uses to kind of better represent that there's some different things happening. So the 2 most common types of mixed uses that we see happening is what we're calling industrial flex space. So it means like maybe there's like a retail next to an office, next to manufacturing. We did like a weighted average approach, kind of taking in all those ITE averages to come up with kind of a blended average, which helps kind of lower, kind of right size what bucket they would be in. So things that we kind of called industrial flex space are in bin 2 of what we'll show you. Another really common mixed use type of space is warehouse and office, kind of being co-located together. And that was put in bin 1, just based on that average trip rate that we did. And for all of this, just a note of we need to kind of balance a few things here when we think about mixed use. Yes, in an ideal world, we could get everything blended and perfectly right, and this is the bin you go to, but uses change a lot. So we have to kind of balance, where do we kind of assign some folks in their categories with the kind of administrative burden or requirement of figuring out where it goes. So don't necessarily recommend to have like 40 different mixed use codes. It's kind of like, let's think of the ones that are most common, and that's kind of how we are approaching it. And then if you go, and there's another draft. Oh, can you go back one, please? Oh, I think one of the slides might be missing from this one. Maybe I'll just talk through it. Yeah, it might just take me a second to get in the meeting. I guess this is a good moment if anyone has any questions so far on what we're presenting.
Is it making sense? Hopefully a little bit. Because what she's going to pull up the next couple slides are, we need to do the same thing for office and medical office. And we also looked at geographic areas around the hospital, or they're just out in a general commercial lot somewhere. Same type of things that we did, just, these same questions came up during the system development charge methodology on transportation. So there's some parallels that we could use from that kind of policy guidance that we brought over into this.
While she's looking for that, looking forward, we had said when we first did this in phase 1 that we're going to go find data for phase 2. That'll give us the opportunity then to hone down, and that's what you're presenting today. The codes, the transportation book, all these are great data sources. When it relates to, and I don't want to take this sideways at all, but I'll be very curious when we show up here next year as we go to 15%, what the additional data stuff is we're going to have, and are we planning now for making this data better and better as we can along the way? That's all I had.
Yeah, a couple points on that. One, yes, we will continually refine the data as it comes in, and hopefully that really starts to, improve the model as we go. The second thing just to note is there's already built into the resolution that there's a larger transportation funding conversation that council wants to have around between adopting anything between phase 2 and phase 3 of the fee, because I think they want to explore, do we want to use the transportation fee as the only revenue source, or do we want to look at other things? If you remember back the funding puzzle that we showed several times, do they want to look at other things that were recommended in the transportation system plan for potential funding? But the key is we will always be updating the data for compliance. And that's one of the things, again, we go back to the business registration. How do we want to use that tool, not only to gain compliance for the transportation fee, but for other things that we're trying to do with that registration program as well. So.
All right. Thanks for bearing with me. So just to kind of wrap up, other ways we're thinking about mixed use, mixed business use accounts. So there's also a few ways in which we're thinking about medical uses and how we're doing this initial model. So hospital or any medical office building on the hospital campus is a lower trip rate. So we're saying that would be assigned bin 2. A medical office building near the hospital. So this is called our medical overlay district. It's designated in the Bend Development Code. That's bin 3. So there's kind of that ITE data behind it that shows lower trip rate for certain types of medical uses. So we're kind of building a little bit of nuance in the structure, specifically around medical. Otherwise, a regular medical office building where there's a number of different types of medical uses happening in one office building based on trip rate would be in bin 4. So a slightly higher assignment. And then we also have an approach here where if it's mixed medical, but with other types of uses like regular office, it would actually be in bin 3 because that's a slightly lower trip rate. So it's kind of taking in that representative average. There's also an approach here of integrated retail uses. So for kind of like commercial mix where there's a lot of different kind of retail happening and that square footage of that space is over 150,000 square feet. There's also that ITE databases that it's a lower trip rate. That would be assigned to bin 3. And when there's mixed retail use, but it's less than 150,000 square feet, that would be in bin 4. And that's very similar to, it's just backed up in ITE, and we also did that within the SDC methodology update. So there's kind of that consistency there. And then another thing that we're proposing here is kind of area rates. So for commercial zones where there's many different accounts and they're operating as a consolidated area, even though an individual account in that area might be less than 150,000 square feet, it's like we're kind of geofencing it and recognizing this all operates together as a group. So we're calling out the central business district, which is essentially downtown, and the old mill district as qualifying for kind of that bin 3 rate. Even if you were just to look at an account basis, there might be varying square foots. We're like, okay, you're operating together as one commercial space. So kind of recognizing that lower bin rate should be applied.
Sarah, with the Old Mill District, the letter from them, did you present to them that they would be in bin 3, or is this a modification?
We talked to them. We'd already anticipating doing this. We talked to them last week around this to say that you would be one of these consolidated areas, especially your shopping area. We would put all that as one use because there's different properties are parcelized differently. It's one property and you have multiple buildings on it, or you have, 5 or 6 buildings that are independently owned, but they're in one shopping center, those type of uses.
And they were okay with this?
I would say we made them aware of what we were doing and where but this is the first time we're actually unveiling the bin strategies and everything. We didn't say you're specifically in bin 3 or 4. We just said, because of that integration, you would be put into a lower category than just a standalone retail.
And it does say that they wanted to be looked at as a singular entity for phase 2, but I don't know exactly what that means. If that means like being called out in a like this,
Yeah,
or
when it's one of those, they have multiple types of uses in there. So you can think about the Old Mill shopping area, right? That's one area, but then they also have offices and hotels and other things. And so that's one of the things that we'll try to figure out is like what actually are like uses that should be together
within that district.
Yeah.
It's a lot of buildup. I'm sure you guys are all thinking, okay, what are the numbers? So let's talk about it. So this is a first look at the rates. So I'll go through this one more quickly because it's more on the residential side, not what you'll be kind of considering today, but just wanted to present the full package that the consultant we're working with is looking at the whole, everyone's rates. So I know we're talking about the non-residential portion of this, but this is also showing what the residential increase would be. And under the kind of initial cut draft rates, it slightly less than doubles from what it is currently on the residential side. And that kind of has to do with that tune-up of as we get better data, even though we know we're doubling our revenue recovery, we know there's account growth, things like that. So I think to address kind of Mark's earlier question too, it's like we're constantly going to be looking and right sizing as we have better data. Oh, maybe the rates need to be adjusted down or slightly up to kind of get that revenue recovery. So this is kind of an example of that. So, and then on the non-residential side, kind of the same thing for the existing special unit classes. So I'm showing schools, lodging by number of rooms, the short-term rental supplement, parks per acre. Those are all going up, but not quite by that 2 times total. It's going just slightly less than that in this initial cut. Here on the next slide is where we're showing these new special unit classes that we're introducing. So we're not talking about the bins yet, that will be the next slide, but just showing you what the other special units are. So in phase 1, we currently don't charge a partial short-term rental supplement. So in phase 2, we have now a figure associated with that, $100 per year. And then the other one, so gas stations, where there's not a convenience store, $31 per fueling position. Gas stations with a convenience store, $62. Cemetery has a per acre rate of $375. Golf course, $18.50 per hole. We also intend to.
It's just the way the IT do it.
Real,
Well,
yeah.
18 for 18 holes.
I know.
There are 9-hole golf courses around town. That's actually-
And then ck wash is another one we want to develop, but we need to do some manual collection of that data, but that would be per stall. I don't know. Trying to remember all the units of measurement. So first look at the special unit rates.
Sarah, just a
Yeah.
question for clarification. I may have missed the earlier conversations around residential.
Mhm.
But if they have just a room or a section of their house at their short-term rental, wouldn't they already be paying the fee for the whole house?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So they're already paying a residential fee, so that supplemental fee is adjusted to reflect the difference in, say, if you just looked at what their impact is. So there's kind of that total number, but let's subtract the fact that they're already paying a residential fee
Okay.
separately. So it does it essentially incorporates the fact that there's a residential fee happening and this now STR.
And the
fee.
assumption there is if it's a short-term rental, there's more traffic. or-
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
Exactly. Okay, and so this is the first cut of these phase 2 bin rates. So you see the bin number on the far left, that trip range, so where we're cutting off where the bin is occurring. The types of uses that are happening in each bin. So this is just a slightly more detailed list than what you saw on the graph. A reminder that in phase 1, currently everyone is charged $6.25 per 1,000 square feet, except when you're really high square footage, you kind of have like a tiered structure where you pay a different rate on your really high square footage. So in phase 2, the proposed fee is on that far right. So we have from $5 per 1,000 square feet in that lowest bin to $7 in bin 2, $13 in bin 3, $21 in bin 4, $31 in bin 5, and $49 per 1,000 square feet in bin 6. So you can see it's not a linear relationship of how that kind of ends up shaking out.
Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Hopefully. You're probably saying, well, what does that mean in bill cost?
And we will tell you. So this is the first look at taking that rate scenario and bill examples. So on the far left of this chart, you see the bin that they would be assigned to. We have example accounts, the square footage of that account, and what they're currently paying per month on average in phase 1. So based on the rates I showed you in the previous slide, this is what their phase 2 monthly bill would be. So on kind of the lower end, you see for those in bin 1, in some cases, that bill is going down a little bit or not quite up as much. A lot of that is thinking about how the square footage comes into play here. And that's why you kind of see some of that differing. And a reminder that that really high square footage tends to happen with lower bins. I know that's not always the case, but when you think of manufacturing or warehouse or distribution centers, these are high square footage facilities. And then as you kind of move through the bins and kind of how the rates shake out, you start to see increases to, slightly less than doubling, like for the hospital. You see kind of a big jump for shopping that's greater than 150,000 square feet. Kind of a doubling for medical office near the hospital. Superstore, you see kind of a bigger increase. Same with medical office and high turnover restaurant. For bank and fast food, the examples here, you see on a kind of a percentage basis, the bills increase quite a lot, but when you're thinking of smaller square footage footprints, kind of the absolute bill is less overall. So this is kind of how the relationship starts to kind of pan out.
And these are totals, not then times 1,000, right?
These are the monthly.
Total. monthly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
Mhm.
Last one I was confusing myself.
Okay.
with
Just to
if
give
we
you
were
some
multiplying.
representation, yeah.
Yeah.
Just making sure.
We feel like
Yes,
this is the best representation of what this
What it would
structure
actually-
really starts, when you do the math, what the structure really starts to put out.
What's the definition of a high turnover restaurant versus fast food?
The fast food, I can ask our consultant just to make sure, but high turnover is still like a sit down restaurant where I think the fast food factors in the drive through. Is that your?
Yeah, so,
Drive-through
yeah,
versus not.
like McDonald's, Burger King, those are the fast foods.
Right.
But you could also have just like a burrito shop or something in a strip center, that would be a high turnover. That makes sense.
Yeah, I was just thinking a sit down restaurant, that's a, significant jump.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Over.
So that's why we wanted to present this data to everyone and say, okay, well, what do we feel like, where are the pressure points in this? And again, are there other uses that you'd like to see to make sure we're getting the right representative examples out there?
And we've talked about this just at a very preliminary state, but the idea of a fee cap potentially. If we feel like there's a certain amount that we would like all bills to stay under, then that's a conversation that we can have as a policy recommendation that would come from BDOT.
So can I ask my question now, Russ?
You can, yes, you can.
Because the far right proposed draft, that's using that model where you guys described it as use the high end for one,
Right,
and then you use weighted averages for a couple of the others. Right?
for 2 through 5, and then we
Yeah.
use the low end on 6.
Gotcha. And so, part of, I think the challenge with this is if we start to sort of think about this in terms of like what additional data we would ask for and how that changes over time. Because we've moved away from, or we didn't see it, basically, like that pure statistical average, like using the mean or mode as a reference. The exceptions become more problematic the more data you get and the more clarification you get later down the road, because then you got to go back and go, oh, well, we jerry-rigged this one this time. And so it'd be good to see, if you go back to that,
Mhm.
the chart, yeah, it'd be good to see just the straight math, where you came out just using the mean or mode for those bell curves. Because at that point, I think it'll allow us to sort of see what's fair and what's not fair, or
Yeah.
where the stretch points are against what you propose in that far right-hand column.
I can also say if there is interest, I mean, because we want to make sure that people understand this, because that's what we're doing now is we're tinkering with this.
Yes.
We're playing with it, like, what if you do this, or add this, or do this, or combine these things? If there's interest, we can set up another technical meeting and sit down and actually go through the model and tinker with it if they're, to make sure people understand kind of the relationships of how this works from a technical side. We're more than willing to do that. We're just trying to present that this first cut to say, here's what we're thinking. We are noticing, I mean, I think it moves, the scale moves a little bit when you start saying, I'm going to move it from like the mean to the median or the weighted average, because you're still in this middle of the bucket. The bigger changes start to happen when you play with, I'm going to combine these out, like buckets 1 and 2 or buckets 5 and 6. And you see more movement on that than you would, are we going to use the median or the average or the weighted average within each bucket?
And I will say, we could certainly get the numbers so you have them, but from memory, I know that if we did, like, say, just a weighted average down the middle for everyone, you kind of see the tails of it change a bit. So I think instead of like $5 per 1,000 square feet, it's like 2 or 3. And then that bucket 6 goes to like 60 something. So that's just where you see, whereas it kind of just shifts slightly in those middle ones. So that's where you start to see the relationship and kind of relative impact, but we can,
Yeah, so using the weighted average, now we're using averages on top of averages, that gets hella tricky, right? And it becomes difficult to explain to someone why they're in that category. And they could easily say, well, I should, because of the weights, you use the wrong weights for me, right? And that's what I'm saying, like, when we start making the exceptions, it becomes harder and harder to explain than rationalize. I get why we're doing it.
Yeah.
But it just becomes more difficult, particularly once you get better ITE data, then and if it leads to dramatic shifts, people begin to lose trust in why you did it in the first place, right? And so it would be good to, I personally would volunteer to sit down and go those.
Glad you will.
That's why I wanted to put it out there, because there are, as soon as, I mean, Sarah and I, that's what we're doing over the past couple of days, of just, you look at the monitor and go, oh, do this and do that, and you go, oh, okay, I see where big impacts happen or little impacts happen, right? And we agree with you on, we want to simplify it as approach as we can get that people can easily understand, but also have enough levels of analysis in it that it's equitable across kind of all the different types of uses that are listed.
Did you run any scenarios where the lowest rate continues to be the 625? So that bucket bins 1 and 2 would absorb a little bit more.
We could do that, yeah, because we played another, one of the things that we were looking at is we recommend kind of combining, I think, buckets 5 and 6, just because 6 is such a small percentage and an outlier, and I think we can pull, it works a little bit better, and it also, I think it's going to clear up some confusion, because you don't get high turnover restaurant and fast food, and right, they're in the same thing, and they're just calculated together. So those are the type of things that we're looking at, but that's one of the things we would like to hear is that, yeah, do we want to set that minimum to the 625? We can definitely do that, and then it'll just readjust all the way. I
mean, everyone likes to have their bills lowered, but I think especially in the middle, they're gonna see significant increases. Is there a way to buffer that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great point. Why is manufacturing just higher because they have more people work, like there's versus warehouse, like it's storage, so less trips.
More people and more things coming in and out sometimes too. You're getting more deliveries and things like that in a manufacturing environment.
in this example, this example has a lot of square footage. So that's why their bill just kind of in absolute terms looks more, but they have the same multiplier because they're both bin 1.
But when you look, they're both in the same bin, right? So that's what we're trying to figure out. How do we link all the right similar uses together? And then you look at each individual bin and say, okay, now how do we come up with that, whatever that number is for that bin?
I mean, from a very big picture standpoint, knowing that, bin 3-ish, 4, like where the general population is interacting with it the most, that's where you're going, that's where you're driving, all of those things, those being higher, and it's all being based on trips and roads and all of that. Like in a very generalized sense I can understand getting there, that those have the most, I think, long-term, when there's like environmental concerns and goals that are driving towards that, and that, I mean, this could be a lever that starts to incentivize reducing trip counts where general public and population is going in order to make a bigger difference in our city from that standpoint. That's not going to be an instant thing, but that's where I start to go. Like I said, big picture.
No, and there's been questions from council too of like, is this a tool that we can use to incentivize certain things that we want to see happen in the city around the transportation system? It's like, yes and no, because in theory, yes, but we're also then what do we do? We're still trying to generate that revenue target, right? So it's kind of twofold of the question that BDOT's been asked is, well, how do I generate, what's the structure to generate $4.7 million from non-residential accounts? But we do want, I think it's fair with BDOT too. The second part of that is, well, what is the impact of that to the community and these businesses? Is that tolerable, right? It's kind of, we want to make sure we capture.
That's just going to come to the consumer, which then you talk about cost of living in the city of Bend. I don't see any one of those high dollar accounts necessarily not being able to pass. Maybe I mean, even manufacturing, you could probably argue that. So really, you're just asking residents to.
Yeah, how do you, what's the best way to distribute that?
Mark, that's a question.
Well, that was just a good segue. My question was just to confirm that if we pull $1 out of the hospital line, we got to find it someplace else. It has to go somewhere else. So while we can talk about the models and things and are we being equitable for the different categories, I think at some point, like you said, you're just gonna have to pick a number of categories, not too many, but not too few. You're probably going to deal with some companies that want to be in a different category or will try to convince us of that. But we have to make up this revenue. And so that's the game, right? Just wanted to confirm that.
Yep, that's basically the task that we've been asked to do, is to figure out how do we come up with this type of revenue from a transportation fee that we can assign based on the impact on the system.
And the number of the transportation fee to establish the budget was from the city, or the feedback that you guys got on what this city residents wanted to see from the transportation? What is the?
Yeah, it's
that-
combined both with the budget needs to provide a certain level of service and kind of as dealing with every other industry or business, the budget constraints with inflation and everything else that the city also deals with. Then also provide certain levels of programs and infrastructure and capital improvements that the community wants, especially around the multimodal system. So how do we improve levels of service around there? Figure out, come up with pedestrian and bicycle master plans that prioritize improvements and gaps in the network, and then provide a funding source to actually go and start to fill in those gaps, because we have very limited transportation funding revenue sources coming in, unlike utilities, water and sewer, where we have utility rates, which is, that's the main driver, and you can adjust those if you need to based off of whatever's going on in those accounts.
And from what I remember of the first couple that you mentioned, because I was like, did we talk about that? The same thing. So, was what I thought we had asked for was when you tell the residents what some of those service levels cost, did they still say they wanted them? Because I think it's all fine and good if we say it's $4 million and we're raising these funds and this is how you get there. But I don't think that I ever, at least I can't remember, that we went back and got an answer on that of, okay, we asked for this, everybody's gonna ask for everything. It costs $4 million, whatever, now do you still want those things, or do you want half of those things?
Yeah.
And then all of these numbers change because you're splitting the cost in half. So has that work been done?
The refinement loop is about to start, but it's a little bit, it's after this exercise. So just to ground how we got here in the first place, transportation system plan was updated in the city. That's the city's master plan, had a list, and through a lot of community input and involvement in that process, it got put in there. This is kind of how we want the transportation system to operate. This is where we want to see the level of improvements, and here are certain funding. This is the gap of funding. So if you go all the way back, remember, we had about $1 billion worth of capital and O&M cost on the system over 20 years, and our existing revenue source only got us to about half of that. So this is one of those tools to try to figure out how do you make up those gaps in that difference between how we want the system to operate and function versus the existing revenue sources that are coming in. We're about to launch into the updated growth plan, which you've been hearing about. You're actually going to hear about a part of that later on around the target sector analysis. Over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to be having this very large conversation around how we're going to grow as a city, where we're going to grow, what are the impacts of the infrastructure systems, which will lead to an update to the transportation system plan, which starts that whole loop again of how do we want the system to work, how do we want to maintain it, what's the funding gap, and what are the structures to get there. In terms of impacts to businesses, that's why we have BDAB and the council to provide. They are the kind of the policy board for the city. So that's one of the things too we want to get to. Yeah, this is how the math works, but also what does that translate to every day for the businesses, and where is that ceiling or tolerance of what we can ask the community to do, or do we need to have a different conversation of what are we not doing?
Just in preparation for that conversation with the consultant, looking at the formulas, if we could come up with a par value, right? What I mean by that is, if we just took all of what we know the nut we're trying to hit right now is 4.7 million, right?
Right.
If we took the total square footage, right? And we assumed that there was only one group that was gonna get built, one
bucket.
entity, right? So you take the total square footage, you take the total, if we could calculate what the total universal trips are right now. And use that to sort of break down that 4.7 million to what that part.
So if you go back to the phase one, phase two, basically it would be around $12 to $13.
Got it.
Because you would
Where-
basically
where's
just
that?
take the 625 and double it, because that's exactly what we did in phase one.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
So that if you want, you just like, everybody's in one bucket.
Yep.
It's, probably it's a little less than 625 doubled, but that's the closest approximation. So you're sitting right around bin 3.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think the reason that we asked for something more than that is because there is such variation in like actual transportation
Yeah.
costs associated with the extremes, right?
Understood. But that 13, it was 1350
Would be, the easiest is take the 625 and double it,
Okay.
right?
1250.
Because phase one was 5 million, phase two is 10 million.
Got it.
So
That helps to sort of, like, again, if we start just looking at the pure math of this, then you help people understand where they're being discounted and where they're getting premium, right? Just by looking at that 13, sorry, I keep saying 13, the 1250. I think that's a good place to kind of start.
yeah,
And again, just to get everybody grounded and set around that, and then we can start tweaking. as we
Tweaking
set
it.
around Yeah.
because when we started this, we didn't have all that secondary data that we've been working on now to get that. So I also want to do a time check with you, Cyrus. How much more time do we have?
15 minutes.
Okay. So let us go through a couple more questions here and then we can kind of circle back of, okay, what do we want to do over the next 2 weeks?
Yeah, so now that we kind of walk through the data, kind of know what we're looking at in that first cut, I think this is where we start really getting into those policy recommendations and questions. So number of bins, should it be 6? Should we consolidate? So kind of when we think about fewer bins, yes, there's easier administrative management. So someone says, oh, that's not my use. They might not be moving bins, so less of that kind of switching. And then you're having a broader average, so you're kind of absorbing the impact of higher uses throughout the model. With more bins, you have more of that administrative lift, but that potentially more equitable rate structure where it's right sized to your high trip generator, so you're paying more than this low trip generator. A note again that bin 6 does reflect some of that data variability, inconsistency, just because it's only 1% of the total square footage. So I think in terms of staff recommendation, if we were looking at consolidating bins, we'd recommend looking at combining those bins 5 and 6, just from a how much of the square footage is happening in those bins kind of perspective.
I do want to add one thing too, working with our consultant who's done this in other cities, it's never apples to apples because revenue generation and types of businesses are changing. But when you see the different bin structures and kind of the associated rates, we're in parallel with how other cities are doing it, in terms of just kind of how those numbers increase and the kind of the exponential rise as you get up in the higher uses. We see that in other fee structures, and if you're interested, we could show those to you as well, just so you get an idea.
What was the rationale for doing 2, 5 and 6 as a separate?
Just because when you look at the tail, there is a rapid movement of trips
Number of
that
trips, yeah.
really goes exponential. So we just were like, well, and that's where you see the gas stations, convenience stores, the fast food and those much higher uses. And we were like, well, it doesn't make sense just because all of a sudden you just see this big jump in trip rates from
It goes-
last bin goes from 100 to like 300 or something
It's like
that.
78 to 300.
Yeah, so it's
Mhm.
that's why we
But all
just
the ones in 6 are over 100. And all the ones in 5 are less than 80.
that's what we were working this morning. It's like, what happens when you combine 5 and 6? It's like, I think that makes a little bit more sense on the data points.
Yeah, statistically, it looks like there is justification for the 5, and I actually written that on my notes. That like it looks like you can combine 5 and 6,
Yeah,
and I just wasn't sure with the
slice.
yellow line if it was a statistical break or an arbitrary break. That makes a difference. But you said that it was kind of a little bit of both, and so it does look as if you could get away with 5.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
And then, oh, yes,
Where do you anticipate pushback?
Well, I think from the same places we got it before. I think medical, I think we know medical. In fact, we're just, the layout of this is we want to come back in front of you in a couple weeks and get a recommendation to take to council. Have a work session in council at the first meeting of April. And then throughout the month of April, go get community feedback on it and then bring it back to council at the first meeting in May for adoption. Because we know we know it's compounding, right? If you look at energy prices and, everything, just inflationary issues going on and the unknown and uncertainty of what's going on. We want to get this out and know where the pain points are going to be so council can make a right decision on it. But pretty much, I definitely think the ones that are in those higher buckets, when they see the numbers, those are the ones that are probably going to be a little bit more vocal and kind of the impacts to the businesses.
So following that up, then. What's the alternate math problem look like? If you anticipate that pushback and you readjust buckets, or like, do you have a vision of a reaction that you could have to make it makes more sense for those people? I mean, at some point you're collecting a fixed amount of money, whatever that 15 million bucks, 10 million bucks. So you're just redistributing the curve at some point. But in anticipating or trying to anticipate, the equity or inequity that some people will feel like when you're scenario planning. I don't know what that looks like. I'm just asking the question, like, if you can anticipate that, does it change your?
Yeah, I think you'd be combining buckets is probably the way you would do it. But then you have the people on the lower end of that are saying, hey, now I'm getting charged more to offset someone's higher impact. Because we also want to have a methodology that has some solid backing on it too, right?
Yeah.
You can make individual policy discussions, but I know Elizabeth's right over my shoulder here and she wants to make sure there's good justifications to back up that. And what we do and how we set that, just to make sure we're sitting on a very sound methodology on how this is all calculated. But I do think, like, if there is concern about those higher ends, then yes, you would say, do we combine buckets 3, 4, and 5, or buckets 4 and 5? And those, we can run through a couple of those analysis. Sarah was working with the model. It's pretty easy to do that on the fly to get a high level understanding of what's going on.
Yeah.
I think my biggest concerns are like that middle tier of hospitals and shopping centers, really taking a big jump. And I would be interested in what it looks like if we have that minimum at 625 for the lower end, how much that alleviates the pressure.
Yeah, I guess.
this is the bin.
Yeah.
The bin discussion. I think it's like, what other scenarios or information would you like to see, which I think we're hearing from you to help kind of.
Yeah, I would consider looking at 4, 5, and 6 being one, but 3 seems like they all have, like 4, 5, and 6 all have a spike in, well, I guess 4 has a really high increase in square footage, but 3 is fairly. It has less significant variation in square footage.
So we can do one where we'll bring bucket 1 up to the minimum, right? Then we'll combine one, we'll do a run combining 5 and 6, and then do another one combining 4, 5, and 6. That make sense?
Just noticed another slide here that is combining 5 and 6. Do you guys have that?
We ran it this morning, so here's an example. If you combine 5 and 6. So if you look at the chart, the first column there is what we just showed you on the 6 bin scenario. If you combine 5 and 6, you can see what that does. Basically just really affects bin 5. And then do we have so this is what we would show you. We could come back with a bunch of different scenarios that shows kind of what the impact is. So that's where you can start to see the movement and some of the adjustments that occur. But you can also start to see, as you start tinkering on some of the stuff, where you see changes and where you don't, or significant changes, right?
Yeah. I don't know if you're gonna get away from that distribution you're seeing right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Because of the way the math works.
Right.
And so then you're gonna have to come up with the alternative reasons for why you're discounting.
But I think that's what we can do is we can just build out this chart pretty quickly and get that to you early. We just want to make sure we have the right kind of scenarios and for heading in the right direction.
Just going back to Gary's question for a second. So his question was, what was your question again? I'm just kidding.
It was a great question though.
Yeah, right. Next question. In terms of scenario planning, right? I think part of the answer is, hey, look, guys, we're gonna come back in a year. We're gonna continue to
Yes.
refine this. That's part of it. The other thing I think is possible, if there are cities that have implemented this and that are 2-3 years out, and understanding what actions, where they saw changes, right? Because in there's some elasticity, right? There's gonna be some folks or some groups that are gonna take actions, and you're gonna inadvertently incentivize and disincentivize some behaviors. And so if there's a history of, if there are some cities out there that have already implemented this 2-3 years out, what did they see change? That'll help sort of you take a forecast of this, saying,
Yep.
this is what we kind of expect to see. It will also come back and answer if there's any potential deficits that are hanging out there at risk that you want to take a look at as well.
Yeah, because we can also bring back in terms of, okay, should we do an annual look over the next 2 years, then get on kind of a more periodic 5-year? Because we know, again, we have a question about the business registration of how hard do we want to push on that? You know, even when you think of this, if you don't have a business registration with the city, well, what bucket do we put you in? Right, because it has an impact on how that's distributed. Again, this is on the conservative side because we put everybody into the bucket 1 just to get the high end number, but there's levers we can pull there. But I agree of having, that would be kind of in our recommendation to council too, saying we should look at it in the near future in this way and then have periodic review after that.
And does ITE data get better?
It does, it gets refined. I forget the interval, but I mean, at least every 5 years you get a new manual that comes out that is based, that is based off of actual field surveys that are done across the country for those types of uses.
Most new projects have them baked into them anyways.
Yeah, it's what we use to analyze impacts when someone comes with a new development. It was the base system development charge. So we always looked for that updated manual whenever it comes out.
To that, remind me why we're using square footage?
Because we're trying to relate size to intensity.
But isn't the impact only based on intensity?
It's both. So if you have just use a big box, right? It's a Best Buy is much different than a Costco. So if you don't have the size of the building integrated into the use of into that
It's still
intensity.
based on trips.
It's still based on trips, but it's per 1,000 square feet. That's how most things are. It's X amount of trips per 1,000 square feet of building.
Right, and I guess I'm just saying, like, if you knew the trip count for each condition, could you eliminate the data point of square footage, which makes this the most, like, it's hard to follow that because you've got really high square footage and really low square footage all within the same bucket. And so is there value in that, or can you simplify the data and just say, you have 100 trips, you have 30 trips, this is the fee, and you do it in buckets of 20 or 30 trip counts or whatever, and just simplify the math?
I wish we could, but I'll just use one example. Just take 2 breweries, right? If you've got a small scale brewery, we charge them, and you're charging breweries $200 each. Are we going to charge that brewery the same we're going to charge the Shoots Brewery?
Because you don't know how many trips that specific brewery has.
And the production's a lot higher. You've got a lot more trucks going in and out of there. You have more employees. So that's what that IT manual is trying to encapsulate, is that intent, both of those things. So that's how and that's how most things are done in the transportation world. It's looking at those 2 factors.
Right.
And that's why you actually see on the shopping center below 150,000 square feet and above 150,000 square feet, because there are times when buildings you start to get that kind of softening at the tail of a larger building. You're not generating the same amount of trips per 1,000 square foot of that building. That makes
We always
sense.
look for ways to simplify those, so appreciate.
Yeah, we do appreciate it.
the notion.
But I think that question comes out of the fact that you put all those curves on one chart. And I think it does look confusing when you look at it in its entirety. But if you were to take a single bell curve that you, like one that seems like well structured, and then do each one of them, I think it makes a little bit more sense about the cross reference between trips and size. But when you put it all in one, it's
Yeah.
hard to absorb and to think of it in those parcels.
Right.
I
So,
think we're getting close to time.
yeah, so is there, if there is interest in setting up a meeting to go over it, but one, we'd like to know, and Sarah can work with Cyrus, whether it's just you doing, or anyone else would like to join, be more than happy to show you the innards of how the model runs and run some quick scenarios to understand the relationships.
So just the last question, when the implementation of this is June, so people would actually start to
So
see.
we would become effective July, show up on people's bills probably in August. That's how it ran before. So we are continuing to work, just so this board is aware, we're continuing to work behind the scenes to get our system ready to do something like this within the billing software, because it's a long lead up time to get that structure and test it. We're actually having to redesign the bills to be able to do this. So that behind the scenes, the team is still moving forward, whether it's 5 bins or 6 bins or 4 bins, that's, we can adjust that a little bit easier, but the basis of how we're gonna build this and the structure, we gotta get set up in anticipation of that July 1st date.
Assuming all this data modeling, it all ties back to that 4.7 million.
Yes,
Like it all adds up to that.
Yep.
Okay.
And I know we're running close on time. I think this bin conversation is really the meat of it, but I think just to quickly run through other areas or things to be thinking about, or if you want more information, kind of the other questions are, okay, we kind of walk through how we're approaching medical and integrated retail and those area rates. So does that feel about right? Or are there other scenarios or information that you'd want in regard to how we're kind of thinking about mixed use within the model? So that's kind of another area of recommendation that we're hoping to kind of solidify in a couple weeks. And again, happy to run other ways of looking at it, just kind of based on how this group is thinking about it.
Any thoughts?
Just the one I had already mentioned. For me.
And then another thing, just to kind of run through again, like where we're gonna try to get those policy recommendations. And again, it doesn't mean we need to answer it today, but hopefully when we reconvene in a couple of weeks of kind of figuring out where we kind of land that plane. But for accounts without business registration, so knowing despite our efforts of increasing business registration compliance, we're still gonna have accounts that we do not have that data for. Where should we place those folks in the fee structure? That kind of, that's a policy question.
because we do have their square footage. So now we need the multiplier in the square footage.
So
So what's the communication or methodology for reminding folks that they need to update it annually?
Yeah, so having a business registration's in our code and is a requirement, as we talked about months ago now, our code enforcement is on a complaint basis, and so you imagine we don't get a lot of complaints about businesses not having a registration. So there's that component, but we are trying to do more proactive outbound communication from the city saying, not only is this a requirement by code to have a business registration, but it's also going to be instrumental in how we accurately assess you for the transportation fee. So we have hopefully a letter going out this week to how many accounts?
I think it's about 800 accounts.
So we're hoping that that can at least help. In the communication that Sarah mentioned, that's going to be happening in April, and that Brianna kindly volunteered to help us out with. We're going to have a business open house type of informational session that we also hope can help raise awareness around this, but then also relying on our other partners like the Chamber and EDCO and Visit Bend and the SBDC to also help get that word out.
Just seems like some sort of annual ping, you know, hey, it's
Yeah.
time to re-register.
Yeah, we definitely do that.
Okay.
But I don't necessarily know if folks understand the
There's
the
no
weight.
consequence.
Yeah, and now it's a much larger consequence than it was previously.
So that's one of the things, I don't know if there's any conversation now about where we should put these people, but we need to, right now, for the modeling, we put what we don't know in bin 1. Right, which is the lowest bin. But I think moving into what we want to do,
I said 3.
that's kind of what I'm feeling
Definitely
too.
wouldn't go the other, I
Yeah.
would go 1.
Yeah, but I kind of feel 3, that's a doubling, and then hopefully you're hitting both sides of that spectrum.
Yeah, because it's gonna hopefully average out at the end,
Yeah.
right? You're gonna be too low on revenues potentially in 1. Whereas if, you force people to come back to you and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm actually over here, and then somebody else is gonna land in 5.
Right,
So
Yep.
hopefully in the end, your revenue targets
and then we'll do that again
moderate
in the year.
themselves, yeah.
The only potential risk is if someone should be in bucket 5, but we put them in bucket 3, there's not that incentive to register, but. So I think that's the thing.
Lower risk than 1 though.
Yeah,
Yes.
I
exactly.
mean,
Lower
you could go to
risk,
the other
less
extreme, but then
financial
your mower's
impact
gonna
that
be
might not
off.
be accurate. So that's just the balance, but I think that's just the other
Yeah,
side
all
of that.
Unregistered businesses go in bucket 7.
So-
Triple.
It's a special,
Special.
special bucket.
We will get their attention, right, on the first bill, yeah, so that's,
Your model will be off on whatever.
So right now, we'll-
generation.
we'll say bucket 3, we can actually look at that on our end, but we'll kind of run with that guidance right now, bring that back.
That makes sense.
So those are kind of the big areas, and we'll go and run those additional scenarios that we discussed, but a reminder that we come back in a couple weeks, we have 1 hour to solidify any recommendations. If I guess any other thoughts come up between now and then of things you want to see, we can be working to get that information prepared, shared ahead of time.
I think
Um,
for me, just to reiterate, like, unless we have confirmation that the people that said they asked for stuff know the amount that they're gonna get charged and don't have any revised priorities for how much they think we should be spending, I don't think that, it makes sense for us to make a decision. Like, you can't just shove down $4.7 million down, people's throats if they don't actually want those things when they get told how much they are.
How would you see doing that, Brianna?
I think yes, we can go out and talk to people and ask about that, but I would assume the same way you collected the data.
Yeah, we're gonna put out the proposed rate schedule, and send it out through our normal channels, make sure the chamber's involved. We will get it out to as many people as we can. The same thing we did with phase 1. Again, all of
Well,
our,
but the data collection of saying we want this level of transportation service in our area.
Yeah.
Like, is that the same thing that you're
that's the
talking
thing,
about?
but we're also relying on the adopted transportation system plan that lines out how we want all this to work, which is the guidance policy document for the city. Until that's revised, that's really what leads us to this conversation. That
That's
really,
been adopted without telling anybody how much it would cost.
no, there was a funding that didn't get down to the specifics of what the transportation fee was going to cost, but it was one of the primary tools to look at for funding the gap in the transportation system. That makes sense. So the first,
If I'm hearing it correctly, the policy is adopted, a policy can't be changed, so this is how much it costs, so this is what we gotta do.
this is what we've been asked to do. Again, you can provide, I would say, you can provide your recommendation and concerns to council on what's going on. Around the impact, because I don't disagree with what you're saying.
It just seems like a fault, like why even ask for input? Just charge the fee. I don't know. It just seems silly to be like, well, this is what you asked for. Now that we know how much it is, you can't change what you asked for.
Yeah, but again, we're going from the policy guidance from council on what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to do with the transportation system.
Is that, what was adopted, is that available on a website?
The transportation system plan?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Cyrus can get you the link to it. It's in our comprehensive plan.
Good to look at.
We never got down to this level, but again, and then we also understand there's a lot going on in the world, a lot of impacts to businesses, and that's one of the reasons this got put to BDAB is like, well, where is that tolerance line and where do we start hitting that ceiling on impacts? So, that's a difficult question to answer, but
Because they're coming from
all sources, all
Yeah.
sides. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, everyone, we're gonna take a minute or two to reset before the next agenda item.
We waiting for anybody else?
We're good, yeah.
Okay. All right, we'll get going again. Jonathan and Cyrus.
I think we
Talk
have
about-
Beth and Natalie.
Okay.
Is that? Target sector?
Oh, target sector, sorry. Yeah,
That's okay.
I skipped to 5.
No,
Yeah,
no worries.
target sector analysis presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Chair North. We're gonna go ahead and welcome Beth and Natalie from Echo Northwest. They've been helping with this project for the past several months, and we're happy to be at this point where we're hopefully wrapping things up and having a recommendation today that we can move forward to council at their meeting on April 2nd. So we have Damian and myself here as backup, but I really want Beth and Natalie to share some closing remarks on the final report that you all received earlier.
So Cyrus, should we go ahead and launch into our presentation?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Certainly, certainly. Thank you very much. I'm Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest. I've got Natalie Walker here, also with Echo Northwest. Between us, we did the analysis that you have in front of you about target sectors. Our plan here is to go over things a little bit, emphasizing some of the ways that the target sector analysis may be used in your upcoming policy discussions, because I think that's where it's really most interesting. So to review a little bit, the purpose of the target sector analysis was essentially to provide information that will be helpful in your upcoming economic development strategy, as well as your upcoming economic opportunities analysis, as well as other things the city is doing to support economic development investments and incentives. So we started by looking at state, local, and national economic and socioeconomic trends that were influencing employment and business growth, focusing on a few of those trends that are most important, we think, in the city of Bend. Looking at sectors, so different industries, and then looking across sectors at groupings of businesses, of types of industries that have current strengths, future growth potential, and provide significant employment growth opportunities in Bend. So trying to combine some things and look at them across different industries. So that it's not just, an industry by industry profile. And then provide a framework for future analysis to help identify target sectors as Ben's economy evolves. So I will use the term an iterative analysis throughout this over and over again, because what we're presenting here first for you is some basic analysis. When I say basic, I don't mean simple. I mean fundamental or framework analysis. That can support the work you'll be doing in economic development over the next couple of years. So these are the proposed target sectors. We're calling it cross-sector grouping. So things like recreation and tourism, health systems, building for growth, and technology and innovation. These are not sectors that are necessarily, they're not all manufacturing sectors grouped together or anything like that. There are different ways that Ben's economy is tied together. So for instance, in recreation and tourism, we've started off with outdoor product manufacturing, food and beverage manufacturing, food services and accommodations, and entertainment and recreation. Those are different industries that taken together support your recreation and your tourism economy. So you can look at these groupings in the same way that you've got different industries that are interlocking together that support your economy. Before we go on to talk some about the policies, were there questions about the groupings or how we got to the groupings? We talked about that a fair bit, I think, back in January.
No questions for me.
Okay, sounds like no questions. So then thinking about how are you going to use this information? We'll start off with some of the benefits and risks of using target sectors as a part of your economic development strategy. The target sectors are, I like to think of it as a foundation. They're really important data that sits under your economic development strategy, but data helps you make decisions. It informs your decisions, but data isn't the decisions itself. So some of the benefits to using target sector economies include your locational economies. Another way of saying that is your agglomerative economies. So businesses that have things like shared supply chain or specialized labor, some of that can be across the different sector groupings, or it can be within the different sector groupings. It can also be like industry-specific infrastructure. So for instance, food processing has certain requirements for your water and wastewater system, and it may well be that other industries in your target industries have similar requirements. Looking at ways to improve efficiency, have better access to resource and lower transportation costs. And then working together, looking at ways to accelerate adoption of new technologies, especially for small firms. One of the things that we took away from the analysis for Bend that was helpful for me, because I did some economic development work back in Bend back in 2015 and 16, was understanding that entrepreneurship is really a big foundational part of Bend's economy, as opposed to if you look at something like Hillsborough, where you've got very big firms, a few very big firms dominating the economy. You guys have much more of a mixture of things with a lot of small businesses. Looking at benefits for networking collaboration among your different sectors. So ways to share business knowledge, to enter new markets together, opportunities for joint research or workforce training that may improve industry competitiveness across different businesses, across different sectors, and attracting complementary businesses that creates a ripple effect. So in other words, it increases job and wage growth. And then entrepreneurship and business formation, as I mentioned, those are really important in Bend. And using this approach can support your startups in gaining expertise in supply chain and skilled workforce, et cetera. So it strengthens your overall ecosystem. So another way to look at this with the industries we're talking about is a very diversified economy. We're not talking about overdependence on any one sector at this point. So when we look at the risks to using a target sector approach, you can get over specialization. And I'll talk about Hillsborough again. Hillsborough is very specialized around chip production with Intel, and that creates vulnerability. It's great to have one big type of industry that is supporting your economy and is boom, boom, boom. But as we saw from what happened with wood products industries, resource extraction that way, that leads to vulnerability, to market disruptions, technological shifts, et cetera. And so in looking at the economic at the target sectors we've talked about, we're looking at locally serving sectors as well as export oriented. It's always nice to have a lot of export oriented, but you also need your locally serving industries, in part because what they're doing is they're providing services that people want to experience when they come to visit there, but it also provides quality of life for people who live there. In other words, it's great to be able to go to something like Deschutes Brewery, especially if you like beer. It's great to have those kind of services in your community. So when you're thinking about developing Bend's economic development strategy, you want to think about approaches in part that support growth of the target sectors. And I'm willing to bet in developing the strategy, you'll also think about part of your vision, part of your goals may well be about sectors that aren't in your economic development, your target sectors. And so that may imply a later change in the target sectors based on some other considerations, especially aspirations for new growth. So what you want to think about is what policies and partnerships will you have that support professional networking, so workforce development and social capital? How are you going to support your emerging and your startup businesses, both with capital and skill development? How do you leverage your existing local strengths while continuing to refine and extending the definitions of your sector groupings to focus on emerging specializations? So I always like to use the example, it's getting a little bit old now, but at some point it feels like distant past now, we didn't have smartphones. Nobody conceived of smartphones. But obviously in our day-to-day life now, we understand that those are essential and perhaps they're becoming passé. But what's going to emerge out? And do you have flexibility to go back and look at your target sectors and decide that you've got a hole and you need to change that, address that hole. So you need some policies, some understanding to address opportunities that hadn't been thought of 5 years ago. Of course, economic development in a lot of ways is really all about collaboration and sharing ideas and working together to make a better local economy. Understanding your target industries and being in touch with your players in those target industries can really help the city, the community provide that flexibility. And then aligning infrastructure investments. We've put it last, but in my book, the infrastructure investments are so key to what the city can do to support economic development, and they're so expensive. So making sure you've got the right infrastructure investments that'll support your expected types of growth. So when you're thinking about creating policies for your target sectors, so it's one of the places you should start is thinking about what is inclusive and flexible policies in economic development. How can you leverage your public-private partnerships to align with your economic development policies, or the opposite direction, make sure you're aligning your economic development policies with the public-private partnerships so that you're getting at what the industries actually need. So that really implies a lot of discussions with the different industries, the different businesses in your community. And then, continuing to do that iterative work to maintain your policy alignment with your strengths and your emerging strengths to support your economic development growth. There's a ton of things that you could do for potential future analysis to further understand your target industries. You could do an analysis that looks at your supply chain and your economic contributions of the different businesses in Bend to make sure that you understand how they're contributing and competing, they're supporting and competing with each other, and what the economic flows are there. You can look at entrepreneurship, that's hard to say, and innovation tracking. You could do an analysis of patents, venture capital funding, that kind of thing. You could work with your workforce partners and do a talent assessment for your target sectors. In other words, what kind of skills are lacking in your community? When I say your community, I mean broader Central Oregon, to support those target sectors. And then, of course, having a good hard look at how other Oregon cities have used their target sector analysis in developing their economic development strategies. We provided some information about that is just the highest level of information. And there's, I think, some discussions that you could have about lessons learned from other cities in developing their economic development strategy. So those are our, initial thoughts about how to use this to support your economic development strategy, and some of the things you may want to do with your economic development strategy. So I'll just pause here and ask what questions there are.
I'm curious, outside of questions, we have some of our partners in the room and online that were contacted to be a part of this process and had some stakeholder interviews. So if any partners want to maybe talk about their perspective on the process or what this final product is or how you feel like it can be utilized, I welcome any participation from those members to chime in as well.
Katie's smiling. You made eye contact, so
Okay. Well, I think she covered it, what your options are from this point, and I think it's really important as you're looking forward rather than backwards or statically of where we're at in what factors are going to drive success. So she mentioned a few pieces of analysis you could do. You could take a look at overlapping sectors. Sometimes these sectors, for example, labor force, will have overlapping interests of folks who can move within 2 or 3 different sectors with a skill set that's viable. And that may be something you want to concentrate on, overlapping interests and connectivity in resource utilization, land use, and juxtaposing that with your regional land supply, I think is going to be really important. There'll be a lot of directions you can go. I think one of the biggest questions to ask is, for this market, personally, I think is durability over time, because we know what the economy has done in this community over the past. We've spent 20 years, when I say we, EDCO, us, a whole bunch of folks, in diversifying that workforce, not the workforce, the ecosystem, and the workforce, I guess, that goes with it. So when you look at that and you look at your target sectors, durability over time should be really important. And that means shared resources, shared workforce, interconnectivity of these industry sectors. And I guess really what kind of a base that you want to support with the resources that you have. And there are a lot of different ways to go about it as a next step. And I'm really looking forward to that conversation. But I think this is a good starting place. It gives you firm ground to stand on, but I think the work is really how much do you grow each of these sectors, and what is the interconnectivity of them? What are the vulnerabilities of them over time? And what kind of resources we can put into this as a region in collectively stabilizing and growing. Because one of the things that I do know is missing is that incubation entrepreneurship into the acceleration phase. This is where we have tended to have a lot of folks drop off after they've gotten, especially in the tech sector. One of the vulnerabilities about tech is once you get to a certain spot, everybody wants to sell. And if they sell, are they going to move out of town? And then are you going in a cycle? So kind of understanding the nuances of some of these types of sectors, I think is going to be important too. So Bilal, there's my total unprepared comments.
Unprepared question. What do you see as the role the city specifically can play using this data and promoting these sectors? What are some of the specific tools or levers?
Yep, I think it's really important to understand what it is you're trying to grow, and obviously the city can only do so much. Working with folks like EDCO and the chambers and other businesses in identifying where the growth potential is, evaluating that against how it intersects with housing and how that intersects with getting funds for infrastructure, and having overlapping interests that not only benefit housing, for example, with infrastructure, but also commercial or even an industrial viable area is really important. I think that's the role of the city, is to really think about what are the underpinnings, what can we control, and how do we work with our recruiting partners to figure out how to make an environment that is attractive. Yep.
Thanks, Pete.
Yep.
Mark, go ahead.
This question really is for you, Cyrus. This is a great report, a lot of information. I think it helps us hone in on different things. What is the next step with going down this way?
That's a good question, Mark. And we have Jonathan Taylor, who's our urban renewal manager here, that's going to come up after we get through this agenda item, and we'll kind of talk into what's going on in the urban renewal world with the investment strategy this year and how that's going to coincide with economic development planning. So I appreciate the question, and we'll get there. John, do you have?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I often refer back to Josh Leonard's report. I want to say it was August, a year plus ago, maybe close to 2 years ago, and it was title was something about the mountain towns and how Bend compares so favorably to those in terms of our diversification. So I think back about how Bend over the years has done some things quite well. So I think looking at those recommendations, the kind of thought I have is what are we already good at that we should do more of? And what are those things on that list? Are we not good at, and we need to, so we have to pick, is keep doing the things we're doing that work and then fix, identify those that don't. The other observation I have from the outline that you were speaking from today, Beth, is that most of those recommendations were under our control. Just like land, except for land, and land wasn't really mentioned there. That's probably our biggest barrier to any growth, no matter what the tech sector we pick. And we know that, and we know the housing costs. So I guess the observation I have is we're going to have to focus on doing a few things new, but just not forget about the things we've done well already. And the other observation I have is that the target sectors that you've identified there are all very familiar to us. They're really, it's like I asked Beth the first time I chatted with her, what's not on the list? So that's just a couple of, they're tactical. I think my bottom line response is this is going to be a fairly tactical effort because everything on that list is not on your outline today, were not suggestions about we're not smart at already in some degree. So Beth, thank you for the report. I'm happy to see the iteration of the report coming and coming with sort of some more discrete questions or recommendations. And so thank you for that.
Thank you so much for your input on it. If I could just take one moment and say, I'm a land use person. So I deliberately avoided, in discussion with Cyrus and Damien, of course, going too far down the land use the land use road. You'll be doing that in your economic opportunities analysis. There's a lot to discuss right there. But I will mention that there are things that are certainly not on the list here. I'll call it one that is very land intensive. Large regional distribution centers. You guys are positioned along 97. It's not like you couldn't be looking at that. But you don't have strength in that. There's other communities in the region that have better land for that. And then I would also question whether, given the cost of infrastructure to industrial land, whether that would be a good investment for you. And those are bordering on my opinions. And so I think the discussion and debate about that would come in part through your economic opportunities analysis, Damien, if I'm understanding what the city is intending to do with some of this.
No, that's correct. If I could just follow up on Beth's comment. All the data that you're looking at in the Bend sector analysis report is data we can use and will use with this other product called the economic opportunities analysis. That's where we get into looking at our supply of land for employment, commercial, industrial, mixed employment, public facilities. All the trends data help inform how different industries might use land, whether they're looking at taking advantage of land or in the boundary, or if they might need larger sites. It's going to inform all the work we do on infrastructure planning as well, in terms of looking at not just what the city has control over with water, wastewater collection and treatment and transportation, but also coordinating with our partners like Pacific Power and TDS on electricity and broadband, because those are going to be critical for a number of our target sectors. And then just having the target sectors itself gives us an idea about, what sectors are important for Bend. When you start looking at forecasts of employment by industry, we can see how they're doing and then maybe modifying assumptions to see if we were to take certain actions, what does that do for our forecast? Do they get better or worse based on some of the actions we're looking at as part of our economic opportunities analysis?
That'll be first. Is there a hand? Was that a?
Oh,
that's a cursor?
no,
Okay.
no, just a
Okay.
cursor, yeah. Go
So,
ahead.
just a question, just a quick question. So for Beth and Natalie, and Katie, I invite you to come back if you can, if you feel like answering this question too, but, so when we look at, this point around ideas for potential future analysis and, you have these four bullet points here. In terms of best practices, is this pre or post developing a strategy? Like, are we, I won't give you more context, but is it pre or post developing a strategy?
Best practices?
Yes.
I think the answer is yes.
Yes. Yes, it's pre and post, or yes, is,
I think so.
gotcha. It's like, since, so that's, if that's the, and Beth, I'll give you and Nelly a chance to.
Are you asking about this?
No, I'm asking about the bullet point here,
Oh, okay.
where we talk about ideas for potential future houses. There are four great bullet points here. I guess my question is, when?
The
Yeah,
vision.
yeah, well, because we're on the precipice of kind of
Right.
developing a strategy. How much do these shape that? Or like, are these inputs to it, or are these outputs of it?
Inputs or outputs? I think that they will ultimately honestly be both. Because when you look at what it is that our potential future analysis, for example, I think that when you're developing a plan, there's a lot to be learned from other cities and from the experts that are helping. But when you're, and I think you've made this point a couple of times before, Dwayne, when you're looking at a static picture of things, you can learn from best practices up to that point, but looking forward, that's a different thing. And so I think if I'm answering your question right, is really understanding, to Don's point, what sectors are you going to target? Are there some things that are maybe adjacent? And what can we learn, and how do we apply the best practices of forecasting and moving forward? And so I'm kind of going around about here. I think the inputs and the outputs are totally related.
Gotcha. Again, here's part of the challenge. When is the strategy due?
The strategic
Yes.
do?
Yeah.
Oh, those are good.
There is no due date for the strategy. It is part of the, and Sarah, feel free to fill in here. Part of the draft framework, goals framework that's going to council on Wednesday. It's part of their work session. So I think once they've adopted goals and a budget, then we're on a timeline for developing the strategy. We, the city.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we need to identify, outside of just this list, what other inputs do we want before we begin that broader strategy and formation. I think part of that is also in the urban renewal investment strategy, where we can leverage work and where there is overlap in groupings between urban renewal and economic development. So that's kind of what we're going to get into next. But I don't think there's a set due date other than it being included in the biennium goals, and it's been in the biennium goals for the last 2 biennia. So I think we would certainly hope that it would be done before that.
And Katie, that's kind of what you're saying too. Look for overlapping sectors to make essentially the biggest impact. So if you're pulling also from other resources that the city already has, you're still compounding whatever that decision or plan becomes.
And I think also there will be a time, it's probably going to start at the very beginning, or at least toward the middle, is how much can you actually accomplish? How much can you prioritize what it is you're trying to achieve? And that goes back to best practices, because if you pursue all the things all at once, may have some great googly eyes, but it won't really be a practical strategic plan for a city. So what is the role of the city? What are the best practices in delivering actual increased economic activity in the sectors you're after? And there's only so much you can do at once with a limited amount of money, a limited amount of resources, and frankly, an economy that's kind of wonky at the moment, to be honest. And so I think maybe to answer your question is really focusing on something that's deliverable.
Okay.
So I'll answer the question very similarly to the way everybody else answered it, but a little different. When you look at an economic development strategy, I think it's nice to have a certain amount of data behind you. So you understand, you know, some of the opportunities and some of the things that are perhaps not as good opportunities. And then you start discussing your policy preferences, your vision, essentially. And you start to get on towards, you know, what are our goals, that kind of thing. And then you'll start to ask more questions that lead you down the lines of, you know, oh, we need this kind of analysis or we need that kind of analysis. You could spend all of your time doing great analysis that doesn't move you forward, and I don't advocate that at all. So I'll go back to the idea that this is iterative. You need a certain amount of information to start asking the right questions. Then you need to have discussions with your stakeholders, looking at what other cities have done and what the lessons learned are out of that, all of that. And then perhaps you need some more analysis to support where you're thinking about going so that you go in that kind of productive area that I think we were just talking about.
Okay. So then, to your point about analysis paralysis,
Mm,
one way to kind of break through that is visioning.
yes.
Because if one has a vision, then one is road mapping towards that vision, and that vision is then dictating the analysis. Right now, there's some standard analysis, and we talked about a little bit. So we talked about economic opportunity analysis. On the other side of that coin is the threat analysis, right? And combined with all of that, it's how are we, again, not mistaking activities for progress? How are we progressing towards the vision that will then dictate where the investments go? And that's where that's a matter of time. That's a matter of intentionality and using that time that we have or may not have, such that we are progressing. And so, I would, if I had dollars right now in my pocket, I'd bet dollars to donuts that, like, part of the challenge in the biennial planning is that we may have been mistaking. And again, I wasn't here, so I get the privilege of being able to say that without, because of not being here, but we may have been mistaking activities for progress. And how do we get to the point where we're having the vision? And again, I'll use a city that is fairly dear to me because it's kind of my third home. Like Raleigh, North Carolina, was not always the research triangle that it is today. Like, it took some intentional visioning of saying, we want to be here. And true, there was some baseline analysis saying, what do we have available to us? What are our greatest strengths? But then there was this visioning saying, this is our big, hairy goal that we're going to move towards, given these resources that we have available, and understanding what it would take to sort of invest and move forward. And I guess so. Then the question is that if we could put that visioning intentional discussion on a calendar, and then understand what inputs are needed to go into that, whether it's the economic opportunity analysis combined with a threat analysis, combined with the data that we've gotten today, that helps us get to that point where I think even Don said this, that like, and Beth said it as well. What are those aspirational new growths that we can, when we grow to that next phase, what does it look like, right? And I think that's part of the discussion that it feels like not that we're missing it, but it's the intentionality of having that on the calendar and having the convening around that, and so.
Is it right to assume that the city count, like who decided that for North Carolina?
That's a great question.
Because
And
I
I'm
think
not,
that's the
yeah.
part that's been always like,
Yes.
I've had similar thoughts of like, okay, who does Ben want to be when Ben grows
Yes.
up? I don't think that anybody can really answer that question, or
Yes.
I haven't found the person that
I can-
anybody wants to answer it.
Well, I would, go back to, we spent a couple of years doing significant outreach for the Ben Vision Project. And it's outlined in there. There is a whole section on the economy and multiple stakeholders. It's not the be all end all document, but it's a good starting place. And we don't need to repeat that work.
Right. Yeah.
That's fair.
So maybe having them come and
Yeah,
talk about it.
Vision Bend.
Was there another group that did something similar to, or is that the?
They used to be Bend 2030, but then they evolved to Envision Bend.
I'll think about it for a minute
Okay.
and then I might come up with it. somewhere else.
So what's the ask of us today on this?
To have a recommendation that these proposed target sectors be adopted by council on April 2nd for the uses of the urban renewal investment strategy and future economic development planning efforts. I don't know if I got it word for word, but
Does everybody feel comfortable making a recommendation on these 4 target sectors?
We're just recommending this
Good.
data be used for other stuff.
That those are the 4 sectors.
I have no problem. That sounds great, Gary. I'm just wondering if we have the will and courage to say we want some sort of roadmap of how we're going to get to that visioning, that the deliverable of an economic plan, because Cyrus already talked about it. It's been a miss. So why wouldn't BDAB take the onus upon them to say, yes, this is great, and we need council. I mean, Brianna also said it, like, who's going to be responsible for that vision? And even if it includes coming back and having this discussion about the Ben Vision project and Envision Ben, great. Like, can we put that flag out there and have them respond to it?
I would be supportive of that, and I would be supportive to bring it to council.
Great, thank you.
Come on up. Yeah.
I'm sorry. My name is Jeff Knapp. I'm fairly new. I'm CEO of Visit Bend and very excited to be here working with you all. I just wanted to come up because I just spent about 5 years of my life doing this with my former city. And the fact that you are all embarking on this is really exciting. I just wanted to bring up a couple of things to your question about what the city's role, et cetera, et cetera. I think, and how do we do this and all of those things. I think these are all really vital questions. I, from a partner perspective, I just wanted to give that perspective of the city can only do so much. We can work on policy. We can say we want to be the roller coaster manufacturer, we can play whatever it is, someone has to do that. And so from a partner perspective, what a plan like this does is really identify partners and allows us to build our goals and our strategies around and be more effective. So it aligns our partnership with the chamber, with EDCO, with you to really lean in. And it helps us be ready to move on opportunities collaboratively when they come. We put together a business plan at the same time as a community back in my former community with our city council. We stood up an organization like BDAB to oversee that work. And then our organizations were kind of staffed to that. We kind of worked collaboratively on the data and picking out what was, targeted, what would be the most impactful with all of that data, working collaboratively. It allowed us to be really nimble when we had COVID and we had to react with a lot of resources and how suddenly there's a bunch of resources, we could move very quickly to deploy them because we already had put a lot of work into that plan. That document lives on, whether when you change position or the city council changes or we get new leadership, we're all kind of rowing in that same direction. And I would encourage you to kind of think about the time frame that you're looking at to help keep us all moving in that way. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is we're good with the target sectors specifically.
Is recreation, health, build for growth and technology and innovation.
Hopefully the next step is to work on that visioning process with a kind of stake in the ground from a timeline perspective.
I think we'll get into greater detail about that in the next agenda item as well.
Okay, we get a motion to approve the 4 target sectors.
Okay, I'll go. On behalf of the Bend Economic Development Advisory Board, I move to recommend that the proposed target economic sectors as presented in the presentation given to BDAB on March 3rd, 2025 be adopted by the City Council for purposes of the Bend Urban Renewal Investment Strategy and future economic development planning efforts.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Hi,
I'm gonna abstain because I do think that the recommendation should include the visioning aspect of this. So I agree with it, but I do think that that's important to have. I understand that that's a pre-written statement that would not have foresight to include that. But I do think that's an important aspect of it.
If the board wants to amend this comment, that is appropriate and acceptable.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should.
Does anyone have a?
I'll come up, sorry, it's just a second. Elizabeth Oshel with the City Attorney's Office. So it sounded like you had a motion that was voted on and approved. So if there's an additional motion, rather than kind of going back and amending what's written up here, if there's an additional motion for more that you want from BDAB, this would be the great time to do that.
Such a way that it just requests council to intentionally define a time frame in which the deliverable of the economic plan just to provide a time frame in which the deliverable of the economic plan is will be available.
So it sounds like you have a new motion that we'd look for a second for now to accomplish what you just stated.
Sorry.
The timeline and a vision.
Yes. Thank you.
So not an amendment to this motion, because this one passed. This is a new motion to say a timeline for a deliverable. So, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
a timeline and a vision statement.
Say these exact words. No.
So it would be BDAB would additionally recommend council establish a timeline and a vision statement would be what I hear is the second motion.
And I will second that as well. The economic vision?
I'm gonna say economic development strategy.
Okay.
This sufficient to what you're
Yes, sir.
imagining?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for that. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Damien. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you so much for having us here. Have a good rest of your meeting.
thank you.
Okay, tax increment assistance programs.
Yeah, so we have Jonathan Taylor, our renewal manager, here with us today. A similar presentation was given to the Bend Urban Renewal Agency, which is the same elected body as council at their last meeting. So we've talked previously about the tax increment assistance programs, and you've been apprised that we received 5 applications specifically for the housing affordability track. So we'll review those applications and then talk about the broader investment strategy and how it relates to economic development.
Cyrus, I think I'm gonna start with the strategy first.
Sure.
Since that was a primary conversation, that way any kind of ideas that they have are still fresh, so. All right. So earlier late last year, staff made the recommendation to our core area advisory board, which is the primary advisory board for one of our tax increment areas, which is an area that is defined in the city where incremental value, whether it's generated from the standard incremental growth of ballot measure 50, which is up to 3%, or substantial developments get reinvested back into the community. So the two top projects that are occurring right now that core area is investing in is Second Street streetscape enhancements, which is new street standards being developed on the Second Street between Franklin and Greenwood. And then Borough will contribute up to $2 million for Franklin Avenue improvements. So that being said, we kind of fell short last year of some of our revenue generations for the core area only because these things happen and we plan for those 3 to 5 times over a planned life. And what they decided that CAB wanted to recommend to Borough is to create an investment strategy that can help spur additional development. That way we generate more money to do more things in these areas. And so this is that part of that process. And we are going to be coming back to BDAB over the next several months to get your feedback on policies, programs, investments, and all that stuff. But today is just a general overview of what we're presenting. And then next month, we will talk about infrastructure investments, land and development, investments, and entrepreneurship. So this goal of the plan is to be a short-term guiding document for the agency to invest its tax increment. And basically what we're trying to do is balance what we know is going to be a change in economic market, maybe as of March 4th, tomorrow, or all the way through the next 3 years. But overview is we have identified 4 strategic guiding principles, which will be strategic, sustainable, measurable, and aligned. We want this document to flow from a well-defined strategy. We want it to address both short and long-term objectives, focus selectively on a few key areas that Borough can make the most impact, and evolves over the life of the investment. Sustainable, we do not want to create a dependency in the community on Borough revenue. We want this to be an injection of capital to help individuals be self-reliant and create long-lasting benefits. We want to invest heavily in capacity building and reinforces rather than replaces local business responsibility. We want this to be measurable. So one of the key goals of our new council is to have adequate measures of return for our community and use impact on indicators to determine outcomes and quantity and quality of that development, and also track changes. And we want this strategy to be aligned. So basically everything you were just talking about previously is reflected in what we're trying to do here. So we took that recommendations, what we heard last quarter and in Q2 of last year, and tried to create some guiding principles. Next, we want to focus on housing development, entrepreneurship, infrastructure, business and land development, and beautification. And we've identified 4 different types of investments. So research, we know that in order to make informed decisions about projects and allocations of investments, we actually need to conduct research on those proposed projects and impact to the community. We have short-term investments, 1 to 3 years, medium-term, 3 to 15, and long-term. So questions. I'll parse this out, but this will not be the only time you see this document. So you can ask questions now in the future, but by June, that's when we'll have a final document. So the first goal or strategy we want to focus on is housing development, and we'll get into the site specific in a second about the need, but I think we all know that housing is needed in Bend. So for Borough, we want to, and this is just Borough alone, this is not the city of Bend or any of our adjacent partners, but to help construct 1,000 multifamily units. We want 250 of those to be rented at 90% or below, 3 energy efficiency projects out of all those, and we want to inspire at least 30% or more of local contractors for all of those businesses to be completed. The proposed vision is quality and sustainable housing is available to every resident across a broad spectrum of types, styles, and sizes in current and future TIF areas. And we only have one strategy, which is just to develop housing. We don't want to make this overly complicated. And so what are some of our proposed initiatives? Well, we want to continue to explore and implement the housing rental incentives, which you'll hear in the next agenda item. We now want to start exploring more home ownership funding opportunities. So we really focused over the last 2 years on multifamily rents. So now we want to transition to helping people establish home ownership, which is the greatest source of wealth generation that we could possibly do. And then we also want to monitor the housing market. So the one key aspect that Burra made mention at the last meeting is to tailor these policies based on the need that we're finding. So some of the example programs that we're exploring is obviously the site-specific program, but then in the future, we want to partner with the city of Bend to identify homeownership funding opportunities. So what does that look like? We want to assist any person or household earning less than 120% area median income with homeownership. What that looks like, I don't know yet, but that could include revolving loan funds from Burra, interest rate subsidies, or land banking. Entrepreneurship, we want to partner with our chamber and also EDCO. We don't want to supplant them. So however this looks, we want to assist 10 new startups. We do want to get into the business of providing loans instead of just grants, because we want to create a sustainable loan fund that also can help other individuals, because once the urban renewal districts are term limited, that money is given back to the taxing districts. So if we have something that is revolving, we can have this for a long-term future. And then also build a catalytic fund for each area, as you've heard through the presentation with Beth and Eco Northwest. If we ever get that gold mine or that big fish that we want to land, there's going to be substantial infrastructure investments that are going to be needed in the Juniper Ridge area, because that's where our buildable lands are currently located. And I can tell you, we do not have enough money right there to actually develop the 261 acres that the city owns. So we want to build up for something in the future. So basically focus on local market dynamics and entrepreneurial ecosystems. We want to explore small business funding opportunities and then plan, identify, invest in projects. I think Cyrus has kind of made mention this in the past couple of months. We want to identify neighborhood market services. So a goal of council is to encourage complete communities where people can live, work, and play and walk to the locations that they deem desirable. But one of the things we're finding out that we don't know is what are the neighborhood services where we can actually incentivize success or where they're not actually growing. So for example, we know that we need childcare for the community. So we don't want to focus on that. But what about pharmacies? We're hearing pharmacies are closing. What about other kind of local market services? So we want to do a study on that. Small business funding opportunities, we would contract that out. Borough would not handle that internally, but we would provide the administrative funding opportunities to whoever we partner with to provide low interest loans. And then the catalytic fund, which is helping identify those primary development parcels and invest in those if we ever have that big fish. The bread and butter of urban renewal is infrastructure. So we want to create 5,000 new linear feet of infrastructure and 5 miles of green pathways or non-motorized pedestrian pathways. So basically we want to identify existing barriers to land development, provide and enhance existing connections, and then just general development of tip area greenways. Most of these are already in the process, so we want to continue funding the Franklin undercrossing improvements, continue identifying trail and greenway developments. We are looking at a new infrastructure project, possibly for 2026, for borough recommendation and consideration, which is First Street improvements and the sewer line adjustments. So in that South Bend Central District area, there is needed infrastructure capacity that we need to provide, which is realignment of First Street, and then also the moving and upgrading of the sewer line, which there are about 9 different parcels that could benefit from that. So if Franklin Avenue, 2nd Street and First Street, and that whole kind of downtown adjacent area is a priority, we need to start looking at ways to invest in that area and then expand out. And then something that our engineering department is currently looking at is a construction impact fund that they've approached staff about, which is what happens if borough or the city in an urban renewal district needs to do necessary infrastructure, but it impacts businesses. And so we want to identify, is there a fund that we can provide? I don't know what that looks like yet. They're working on it, not me. But they will recommend it to me and then I will recommend it to Borough about implementation of in the future, if we ever do any more infrastructure improvements in these core area, Juniper Ridge, Murphy's Crossing, or future TIF areas, how can we help those affected businesses? So it's kind of like what happened during COVID, right? You shut down for 3 months. Is there rent coverage? Is there, I don't know yet. We'll see. We'll bring it back to you for your consideration as well. Another bread and butter of urban renewal is business and land development. So we really want to focus on generating growth in Juniper Ridge. And I don't think I have to talk about economics 101, but new capital in the area generates new revenue for needed infrastructure improvements, public safety, parks and recs. So if we can recruit one business, have 5 retention or expansions, create 500 jobs with an average salary of $72,000, I think that goes to the added other side of the seesaw, which is job and wage growth in addition to housing stabilization. That $72,000 is directly related to what it costs to afford a single family multi-unit rent and then for a household. So we're tying all this data together, right? So we're not trying to over leverage or under promise. And then we want to identify and invest in eligible properties, develop these business incentives, and then actively develop and market a business recruitment strategy. And I'll turn that over to Cyrus in the future. So basically we have the site-specific program, which we'll get into next, but it's to incentivize higher wage jobs. We currently have one site assistance program in the Juniper Ridge, but we are going to be recommending to Borough that they apply that to every tax increment area. We want to do a land capacity assessment, which will be different than your buildable lands inventory that Damien will work on, but it'll be based on the real market value versus taxable value versus zoning allowance, and then your target sector. And then you'll identify kind of key parcels, 5 to 10, and that's what we'll focus on because there's only like 4 of us at the city. So 4 properties, I think we might be able to manage it. And then we want to acquire some city-owned land by Borough in the Juniper Ridge area. This will help, one, provide general fund revenues to the city of Bend from Borough, but also it gives Borough greater flexibility to develop this 261 undeveloped acres in the Juniper Ridge area. And then a BRE strategy. I'm from Asheville, so when you said Raleigh was your second home, I was like, all right, this is how you get to that new age development, right? You want to identify who you want to be, and then you tell us who you want us to recruit. And then the other side of urban renewal is to prevent displacement and gentrification, but while also promoting beautification and enhancement. We have not determined the square footage of improvements we want to do. Last year, Borough awarded over $100,000 to core area businesses that provided both internal and external improvements. We are going to recommend that internal improvements be more business loan oriented because that's directly internally facing, and then externally facing is grants because that benefits not only your neighbors, but the broader areas. So it's direct investment, but they'll get to decide that in the coming months. We currently do have one streetscape enhancement project, and that's 2nd Street, but we also want to continue identifying other streets in the future to keep the momentum going of the core area development, and then focus on that facade and landscape beautification program. Now, the non-attractive kind of programming that we have to do is we'll work with our legal team to update some governing documents. Right now, just the way we do our development agreements, we have them as an amendment to the IGA, but I think we want to get more like official development agreements and rules of operation. Borough is considering expanding the core area advisory focus. We would be looking at expanding the core area advisory board and also to include additional responsibilities on assisting of advising Juniper Ridge, Murphy's Crossing, and the site-specific program. We need to look at the North Bend area investments, which means, and I'll go into that on the next slide, but then what Cyrus was saying earlier and what Beth was saying, we're actually going to help BDAB do the supply chain focus on the target sector analysis. And we can do that internally, Cyrus and I. And we will present those findings to you in October. So that way, if you say whatever, one of those clusters, target sectors that you guys just approved, we'll say recreation. Oh, no, what's a more labor intensive one? Healthcare. So let's say, for example, you want primary care providers, but indirectly you need pharmaceutical suppliers to provide something, we would target those two types of distribution instead of like a hospital, right? And so it'd be more targeted. The two areas we want to look at and what we're trying to determine is tax increment the appropriate tool to do the needed development in the Northern Bend area? So on area one, you have the former Caraway project, which is 9 parcels looking to try to develop into 500 residential units with mixed-use commercial and light industrial. They have 14 large infrastructure hurdles that they need to bypass, which is the Northern Interceptors one, which is a massive water sewer line coming from the east side of Juniper Ridge up and over and down into the other side of Juniper Ridge urban renewal area. And then also area 2. So the city and ODOT have an existing intergovernmental agreement for the development of Empire Avenue. Without these improvements, we know that additional development will be limited, not only in area 1, but in Juniper Ridge area, because these areas may impact further development of employment parcels for Juniper Ridge, SB8, which is the housing inclusion of affordable housing on industrial land, and the northern broader employment areas. What I could say, and maybe Russ can just correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have the money to do Empire improvements, so it might be a beneficial use of urban renewal to do that in the future. But Borough will have to determine, is this the right tool to use? And so right now we are gearing up to issue an RFP to do the feasibility and study analysis of what's the revenue that could be generated, what's the area that's needed for impact, and what are future areas of opportunity and also threats to use urban renewal. And then in October, they will determine if they want to move forward with that idea. If not, that's fine. Is that good?
Yeah, we don't have all the money to fix Empire, plus we're trying to coordinate with ODOT, who doesn't have money, much money to either fix that or something.
What is the green shaded area?
That's Juniper Ridge urban renewal area.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically the schedule for your work that we'll be requesting is today, we just want to provide you an overview and just general comments of what you think of the initial presentation of the investment strategy. Your first meeting of April will get more into the business and land development and entrepreneurship and infrastructure. We'll actually propose some funding amounts, some project and programming. And then what that looks like is once we kind of have scope of what, and I'll just take an example, a business loan program, right? So we'll identify the scope, the purpose, what we need to do next, and then we'll take that to Borough. Borough will say, go forth and do that, and then we'll all get together and work on the actual policy and program, and then it will ultimately be up to Borough to approve that policy and program for implementation. So there's still steps that we have to go through, but it kind of gives staff and our advisory boards kind of a work plan for the next year of what we need to craft and create and present to Borough. And then because of the advisory board summit and then also the joint meeting that you all had with AHAC and the environmental committee on electrification, it was also recommended by Borough to have a larger summit with our advisory boards to present this investment strategy, get broader feedback. What are some other areas that staff should look at in terms of economic development, Borough investment? Are there other areas of the community that we're forgetting about? Those type of things. And then we will package all that up and bring it back to Borough on June 4th for official adoption. But like I said at the very beginning, this is a living, breathing document over the next 3 years. So we know that the economy will change. And so we need to be ready to adapt to that as well. Questions?
Well done.
Did you get the document? The bigger document?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Oh,
It was in it.
yes.
Okay.
What is Borough's mission?
We don't have one yet.
Okay.
But our mission really is driven by ORS Chapter 457, which is to provide investments that remedy blight and also provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the community.
Wondering if is Borough aligned with city council relative to the goals of each Should
Yes.
Borough be a separate organization
Oh.
that's more economic minded?
Okay, she's not here. I was gonna defer to Counselor Perkins, but she's not here. So that is a policy conversation that you can bring up with both borough and council members. Staff does not have a view on that. But as of right now, council is borough and borough is council, so they have the same goals.
What is the funding source for borough?
Tax increment finance.
Okay, it's all done.
Yeah, so anything that we do, doesn't come out of the general fund, but it does impact the general fund indirectly. And we'll get into that in the, site-specific investment.
So first of all, great presentation. I had this opportunity to sit on TIF 101 and it was phenomenal. Cause I'm kind of a data junkie. Well done on that. So appreciate that. And I didn't know you from Asheville, but I hate the accent now. So I'm ready for that too.
They all tell me to play it up because it makes me sound sweet. So.
You don't need to be That's great. Just to follow up on Gary's question, in the shadow of that was about, is council aligned with borough and knowing that they're the same entity, but like you just heard the prior discussion about the economic development plan. What's anybody can answer because I'm not sure. What's the difference between your plan right now and as you're talking about this versus what we are talking about in abstract of an economic development plan?
That's a good question. So normally the way that this would have normally worked, right, is borough is the tool to do your strategy. We are the funding source because unless you have a sales tax, a bid, or business improvement district. What I'm trying to help both Cyrus and also BDAB is to kind of get a leap in front of you to provide you an idea of what you want your strategy to look like. So not only will you should focus on these 5 areas, but there are policy conversations that you should focus on. So a strategy should focus on policy. It should focus on tools, partnerships, and areas where you want to focus. And then it's up to you how you want to define that and advocate that, council. But what I was saying to Cyrus earlier this morning is we want to give you all this data and then you work backwards from it. We're doing it a little bit differently, right? Instead of a vision, and I think we know what the vision should be, which is, what was, I don't have it, but it was like, it's council's vision and I can't exactly remember, so I'm probably going to say it wrong, but a place where everyone can thrive here, I think is what their vision is. It's in the document that I sent you on the 3rd page, and then you work backwards from that. And then however you want, you can add in, take away. I mean, you can take away any of this right now, or at least recommend it, but the world's your oyster.
Right. So and this is not a leading question, it's a sincere question. So where did these ideas, the structure come from? Like that you just articulated, that whole plan, where did it come from?
So we know that housing development is very important. So that's going to be a given. Infrastructure is the bread and butter of urban renewal. Everyone wants the core area to be the new downtown. So that's business and beautification and enhancement. Where we're kind of coming up with something different is entrepreneurship, which we don't want to take away from what the chamber is doing, what from EDCO is doing, but we know that their resources are limited. So how can we kind of fill in the gaps? And then the investment types is basically the standard investment portfolio of any redevelopment organization. You want short-term projects and long-term projects. Your long-term projects, for example, it would be 2nd Street improvements, Franklin Undercrossing, or the Hawthorne Bridge, or any kind of infrastructure improvement, because as Beth was saying, infrastructure is the hurdle that everyone has to get over. And so you're investing in what you want your community to look like in 15 years. So take, for example, Cooley Road and Juniper Ridge. We are just now getting to the point where Cooley Road extends all the way through Juniper Ridge, but Juniper Ridge has been in effect since 2008. So it's the long game. Your medium-term investments are like your housing developments, your business recruitment strategies and stuff like that. And then your short-term is stuff that generates goodwill. So small business grants, loans, facade improvements, beautification, murals, stuff like that. Investments that create a sense of place and opportunity. And then research is, that's something that we've heard from several of our council members, but also something that's very important to staff is, if we are going to advocate for policies, both to you and to borough, we want you to at least have as much information as possible. So, one of the reasons why we did a policy justification for the housing and site-specific program is borough really wanted, where does affordability actually stop in the city of Bend? Because you have county average wages, which is 66,000, but your occupational wages is 43. So that means if a single person was living on their own, they're making about $43,000. They need $72,000 to make rent here in Bend, but that doesn't negate what households do, right? So we're trying to find the balance that's equitable to homes, but also to single individuals. I know it's all over the place, so.
No, it's very lucid. Appreciate that. I don't know if you answered the question though, because.
Remember, I'm from the South. Right?
And I was a little bit walking it back to what Gary was asking. So, and maybe I'm having a little schizophrenic moment at war. I'm thinking about this, and like there's a group out there that's kind of schizophrenic. There's council, then there's borough. And like I'm curious of, did this plan come out of borough and not council, or how are we thinking about this plan?
So it
Who
came
spent
out.
the time actually drafting the pieces of it?
Yeah.
So technically, I'm a city employee, but I represent borough, right? And so the Core Area Advisory Board wanted an investment strategy for the core area.
Yeah.
I decided that I think it would be beneficial to include the other urban renewal areas as well.
Right.
And then I presented this to borough, who is now council, created their council goals to implement investment strategy. You're let the legal simplify.
So it is confusing. So urban renewal agencies in the state of Oregon are created under state law. So the state law says there is an urban renewal agency in every city. And then the city can activate it if they want. It's a separate legal entity from the city. It's essentially an agency of the city of Bend, but a separate legal entity. The board of both of those legal entities are the same 7 people.
Mhm.
So borough has statutory powers for urban renewal, and those are laid out in ORS chapter 457, and they're primarily sort of capital construction type of activities. So purchasing property, constructing roads, constructing infrastructure, redeveloping property. So that is what the urban renewal agency, borough of the city of Bend, can do. The way an urban renewal agency gets money is by creating urban renewal areas, where it is, once an urban renewal area is created, the increased growth in tax revenue in those areas is not distributed amongst all the taxing districts. It's given to borough, and then borough can use those funds to engage in redevelopment activities that are identified in the plan that created the district. So what Jonathan is presenting is sort of a strategy that borough can use to approach how is it using these revenues borough has from its different tax increment finance or urban renewal districts or areas.
Gotcha. Here's what it sounds like. Jonathan's over here talking in my right ear. And because I'm right-handed, I'm writing this policy out right here, right? But my left ear, same body, left ear, and my left hand, I can't write. Right? With my left hand. That's what it sounds like. Right? There's a strategy coming forward. There's a strategy coming forward with financing options. That is being developed by a body on this one side. But then this left-handed side is because I'm not ambidextrous. I'm not writing anything.
Is your left-hand side city council?
Yes.
Yeah.
See, I was doing okay.
Let me jump in. Hopefully I can, because in other cities, borough is a separate board, right? So think of this as its own development group for a certain area. for us right now, council and borough are the same thing, but in theory, when they're not council and they're borough, they should be acting in the best interest of what is right and appropriate for borough as laid out in these plans. Those lines do sometimes blur because there's council priorities and this is a tool for what they want to do, but in theory, they're wearing different hats, whether they're sitting in as a council, I'm sitting on council, but as soon as they get out of that meeting and put on their borough hats, they're supposed to be thinking about what is in the best interest to achieve the goals set up for that area that has been defined for urban renewal.
And that said, I think, each urban renewal plan has to comply with and be in conformance with the Bend Comprehensive Plan, which is adopted by City Council. So what borough is doing and is funding and investing in and building needs to be in alignment with those overall development goals set by the City Council through the Bend Comprehensive Plan, which is mostly a land use planning document, but does so it talks about what's being built on the ground. So they are in alignment with think of the City Council, and the City Council adopted plans as the highest. And then what borough does needs to be in alignment with those higher documents.
It's just more at the detail level of this is a tangible thing.
Yeah, like there
versus,
are
we're gonna make this world a better place.
There's defined, so what Jonathan will do is say, okay, borough, we have $5 million of potential capacity. What is our priority that we want to do with those funds? Do we want to put into capital? Do we want to put into an incentive program? But it has to be all bound within the framework of what that plan is trying to achieve for that specific district.
So is it fair to say in some ways it's more efficient and aligned to have both bodies be one instead of borough over here, council doing their own thing?
So sometimes, I will say sometimes yes, sometimes no,
Okay.
because really borough is supposed to be making decisions that are for the best benefit of that district in alignment with kind of the comprehensive plan and the goals of that. And sometimes they're making very, very specific awards or very specific capital improvements that sometimes the policymakers, they want to assign that to another group to do because you're basically a development agency, right? And you're getting just very specific details. And sometimes council wants to be that board, and sometimes in other cities, they say, no, we're going to actually create a board that will make those decisions for us. We're going to give them guidance through our comprehensive plan and how we want to see those areas develop, but those individual specifics about where to assign those dollars, they may choose to have another board make those decisions.
And
Right now, Portland is the only city that has two different
Yeah.
boards. I think is that
In the
right?
state?
And then-
In the state.
And then there's,
Others.
Okay.
and then there's 5 that has a hybrid between a majority of a council and then like 3 other
Oh.
members.
Do we know when a city councilor is running that they're also running for a seat on borough?
That's been the structure for, I think, since 2008.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's defined by our codes and kind of who is the borough board. So
And then you have a
Like we
team,
should know.
a staff.
But that's what's happening.
Jonathan is
You
the
can't.
borough staff and assisted by
Adopt.
city legal, city finance, city real estate. So the city staff supports the borough staff
You are
person.
I am not borough, but yes, I work,
Right.
Yeah.
I work for borough.
Okay.
Well, technically, okay, so in the investment strategy, if you take time, there's a tax increment primer.
Yeah.
And then I'll also send out the Urban Renewal 101 that Dwayne was part of. Like, it will tell you what's my role, what's Elizabeth's role and stuff like that. But I technically work for the city manager, like every other city employee and or his designee, which right now is Matt Stewart, the real estate director. But I represent borough.
So the city provides all the administrative functions for borough. It's paid, when we are working for borough, it's paid for by borough.
It still sounds like borough had the development of an economic, they had the beginnings of an economic development plan, and the city council kind of doesn't. That just seems kind of weird, but.
And we will help you guys with, like, we will get you an economic development strategy.
Probably the best way to think about it is a comprehensive plan lays out how and what we want the city to be.
Yep.
Right? And then to order to achieve those goals, because remember, we're talking about transportation, we don't have a lot of funding sources, so urban renewal, it could be one of those sources. So think of that urban renewal plan as a plan to help satisfy and achieve the goals that are in the comprehensive plan. It's one of many things the city does to achieve this overall plan of how do we build the city.
Makes sense. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
And again, John, thank you very much because it was a great presentation. Each time I've seen you, you've been very insightful. Love the structure. And to your point, it may not have that BHAG, but it has all the makings of putting it together. And most importantly, the financing options included in it. Just one other thing. So, and this is when I saw you do this TIF 101, I saw you and heard you ask the core advisory board for how did you phrase it? Expanding it or?
Expanding the role, so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Got you. So much like, I mean, I don't know how Gary thinks about this, but like, why didn't you ask BDAP to come together with the?
So Elizabeth and I will be working on a couple of policy options about what that could look like.
Okay.
And we're exploring every different type of kind of a merger when they act as an urban renewal agency. I don't know that yet. They just gave us direction last Wednesday to start exploring this opportunity. But what we do want and what we want to value is everyone that just got recently appointed to these boards. And so how do we work that into the longer structure of an advisory board? But yeah, that's an option that we're looking at as well.
Love the curiosity. For the sake of time, we have 18 minutes left and still want to go through 5 applications that we received for the site-specific program for housing affordability. So we'll try to crank through those in the next 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, so just lastly, to wrap up the investment strategy, you'll be getting more information on the 3 primary areas that BDAB will focus on in the next meeting. And so we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what that looks like, what's the goals, what's the policy, and then take whatever feedback we hear from that, put it in the investment strategy. But if it can't fit in the investment strategy, hold on to it for your larger economic development strategy. The next item, so staff is actually going to ask for a recommendation today, and we'll get to that recommendation at the end, but the summary of the proposals, and we'll get into what the site specific is. If these projects get approved on May 7th, because to your point, it gets confusing again about who approves what. Borough approves sometimes, city council approves other. But in the end, if we approve all 5 projects, 893 residential units will be constructed. 153 of those rents will be restricted to households earning 90% AMI or less. It will contribute 12% to our 5-year goal for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. The construction will generate $173 million for the local economy. Reduced rent savings will save households $10.1 million over the life of these programs. All projects meet the enhanced policy for assistance greater than 12 years. And this will end up creating 3 new TIF districts and 1 project in the core area.
Sorry, what was the OH?
The Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, so we'll
Oh,
get to it in about 4
okay.
slides.
Sorry, yep.
So last year you saw the policy justification, and I can send that out again just in case, but 8 out of 10 occupations and 50% of households cannot adequately afford rent for a multifamily unit in Bend. And we just got the new numbers from OHNA, which means Bend will need 33,000 new housing units by 2045 in specific AMI ranges. So what does that look like? They've actually broken down the number of units that we need per AMI, so the area median income. Just to give you reference, 100% area median income for a family of 4 is $104,000. But the average wage in the metro area is $43,000 for an occupational wage. Just to give you a brief, because we're kind of incorporating day-to-day true market data analysis. So if I was a new person moving to Bend today, there are 423 residential units available. The average rent for those units is $2,200. And all 26% of Bend's households have moved to Bend since 2021. So
It's in that last week.
Yeah.
26% of all Bend households have moved to Bend since 2021. So what does these projects do? It actually starts meeting some of the key areas of AMI. So 256 of those units will be for area median income 121% and above. About 500 will be between 80 and 120%, and 11 will be in the 61 to 80%. In the red box, 153 of those will be rent restricted. I don't have to tell you guys this, but you know that the current market and financial conditions are continuing to hinder residential construction and also limiting natural occurring more affordable units. Just to give you a brief what was happening in 2019 versus today. So in 2019, the average rate for multifamily residential construction was 3.71%, and the leverage was 65 to 75%. If these developments had occurred in 2019, they could have saved $36 million in interest payments alone. And to give you an idea, the average rent in Bend in 2019 was $1,400. So it just kind of shows you that developments have to pass on the cost to their tenants. Like I was saying, we might find out tomorrow if tariffs go into effect, but tariffs are going to be a huge hurdle for any of our local construction for residential and multifamily unit. 3 of our developers use wood out of the Yukon, and they're thinking that if they have to do that, the anti-dumping duty will increase 14.5% on their cost, so thereby further increasing overall construction. So to get you guys saw this last year, but for those that did not, the reason that we wanted to create both a housing tax incentive and an employment incentive is we want on one side to encourage good paying jobs that can reduce the overall housing cost burden that a family or a household would experience. And then we also, at the same time, want to incentivize affordable and stable housing for Bend's existing workforce. So we have 3 different policies. We have the housing-based policy, which is if you provide 15% of units that are newly constructed, rented at 90% AMI, with rent increases lower than the statutory allowance, you get a 12-year tax rebate on Burris portion. If you exceed that opportunity, if you provide more than 15% of units, you rent more units at 90% AMI or below, you provide rent increases to more than those dedicated units, or you incorporate energy efficiency standards or supplier and local contractor diversity, you could get up to 30 years tax rebate. For the housing enhanced policy, you have to meet the base policy and or one of the additional 5 bullet points up there. And then on the employment side, it's kind of like a enterprise zone enhanced type of program. You'll use your target sector industries that you just recommended. It'll be a 12-year tax rebate on Burris portion if they create 5 new full-time employment opportunities with average wages of $72,000 or more. And the childcare can actually qualify for the jobs portion and be exempt from the other requirements as long as they provide childcare. Here is a summary of the proposed site-specific round 1. There are total 893 units over 5 projects. 4 of them are on the west side of Bend and 1 is in the core area. And then now we'll go through each one. So we're calling these housing opportunity areas because we want to encourage housing development and affordability in these areas. So this is the first one. It's located on Southwest Reed Market and Southwest Century Drive. It's a 3-parcel, 2-project development. Project 1 is a $60 million project. It's going to build 152 units with the average market rate rent of $2,400. But if they apply and get approved for the enhanced policy, 20% of those units will be rented at 90% AMI, and that affordability will be preserved for 30 years. The reduced rent average is $1,700, so nearly $500 in savings. And then they have applied for further enhancement, which is they're going to use 61% of local contractors and obtain an Energy Star certification. Century Project 2 is a $127 million project. It's total 297 units. The average market rate rent is $2,400. They're proposing to do 15% of units at 90% AMI for 20 years. Their reduced rent average is going to be $1,600. They are also going to apply for the LEED Silver certification and use 23% of local contractors. The Burr investment will be $33.9 million over 30 years. As you saw, one will get a 20-year tax rebate and the other one will get 30-year. The average projected rebate for both projects will be $873,000 for the annual rebate. The impact to the local economy is $117 million. And so for every dollar that Borough invests, it will generate $7.15 for the local economy just through the construction of these projects. And between these two projects, the total projected household savings is $5.6 million. The Britta Ridge housing opportunity area is in the northwestern part of the community at adjacent Camping World RV sales. It is a garden style apartment complex with the projected development cost of $53 million. It's a 20-year vacant lot. The units proposed is 178. The average market rate rent is at $1,800 with the reduced rent average being $1,700. They are proposing 20% of units between 85 and 90% for 30 years of affordability. The enhanced policy is 20% of units and they intend to use 80% of local contractors. Borough's projected investment is $14.2 million over 30 years. It will generate $89 million for the local economy and $1.4 million of savings for households for the rent reduction. Viridian Ridge is up there near COCC. Yes, COCC. It's adjacent to the Church of Latter-day Saints. It's a projected $23 million, 69 unit development. The average market rate rent is $1,700. They're going to do 80% AMI for 24 years with the intention of using 51% of local contractors with a reduced rent average of $1,500. Borough's investment is $6.8 million with a $25 million local economic impact and $1.3 million of total savings. Project platform is located in the core area. They initially applied for the multi-unit tax exemption program, but in order for them to qualify for this program, they have to submit a recension of that application and council will have to repeal that ordinance. And then they can continue on their process with this program. It's a $79 million project in the core area. Total number of units is 199. It's on the former Le Schwab site. The average market rate rent is $2,000. They intend to provide 20% of their units at 90% AMI for 23 years with a reduced rent average of $1,600. Their enhanced policy is the Earth Advantage certification, which they also applied for in their MUPTI application, and as well as using 25% of local contractors. Borough's investment for this project will be $14.4 million. It'll generate $41 million for the local economy and $1.5 million in total household savings for the program duration. Here is the total summary of projects. Borough's investment is $69 million across all of them. It actually will generate $272 million, so a 4-to-1 return if all projects get developed. And the key aspect of this is if they don't develop and provide that affordability, they don't get the rebate. So there's a lot of checks and balances with this program. The total development cost for these 5 projects is $335 million and investment by Borough per the total development cost is 21%. So that's below our threshold of 25%. So we are on mark of not contributing more than we should. Questions? That was a lot and you got 7 minutes.
I reread that or I read that packet before.
One of the bullet points on the EDCO Northwest plan was about public-private alignment and investment, right? So with 21% investment coming from the city, and I know these are already projects that have been started, but there's a long way to go, and as you pointed out, in terms of adding additional housing. And much of Bend fits into opportunity zones, which is part of the 2018 Labor Act. Is there an opportunity? I didn't see anything listed here where opportunity zone or opportunity funds are participating in this. So is there an opportunity?
Okay, clearly we're going to rename our names because it's not opportunity related. So it's probably not going to be called housing opportunity areas anymore based on that conversation. There are 4 opportunity areas within the city of Bend. They primarily overlay most of our employment areas.
So these areas here are not opportunities.
Yes, so we are going to change that. So I apologize.
Gotcha.
So
in the future then, there will be opportunities funds available to sort of support the investment, is that right?
So no, so
Okay.
just forget opportunity area.
So,
From the name, so we're just gonna call it TIF areas. So these are TIF areas being established
yeah,
for the production and provision of providing more affordable units.
understood. What I'm talking about is the stacking. Of
They can
TIF.
do that. That's up to them.
Got it.
Yeah.
Are they aware?
Yes.
Are there opportunity funds here in the Bend area?
If they locate in an area, most of these are not in an opportunity zone area.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Is it a federal program?
Yes.
Yes, it's part of the 2018 Labor Act. But we keep using this word repeatedly, but like, so there's a opportunity, opportunity for this to stack this.
If they were in the proper locations,
Right.
which these
Yes.
ones are not.
Yes.
So there would
I
need to
think
be,
platform is.
Well, yeah, platform also is trying to find their financing and stuff like that. It is staff's purview of not getting into private contract negotiations between private developers, their equity partners and their investors. What we do is we say, we are not going to contribute more than X amount of total development cost into this project. So for example, in the site assistance program, it's no more than 10% of your total development cost.
Yep.
So,
But if opportunity zone funds are contribute, they would make any given project about 31%, 30% ROI, just purely based upon the tax incentives associated with it over 10 years. That's incremental to the ROI that you have listed here. That just seems like a very great way to encourage, and I get where you are in terms of like not having to negotiate with those equity partners, but it seems like there's a way to even so if knowing that the tariffs may be coming, that again is another layer that's to be able to stack onto this to help reduce the cost of construction.
right. So the goal of this program is not only to build more residential units, which is what is desperately needed in Bend, but it's also to encourage more affordability.
Right.
So the primary focus is to remedy blight and
Yes.
provide more affordability.
Yes.
How the private
Yeah.
sector handles that, that is up to them.
Yep.
It is not the city's purview to generate more dollars for a private developer. It is the city's purview to generate overall economic impact and affordability.
Thank you.
one question, sorry,
Oh.
just on that slide, the asterisk next to the 23 for plan length, I was just curious, what is?
Yeah, so they're in the core area, so impact has already been established in 2020, but they're also limited by the plan length itself. So it's 2050 is when the core area goes away, so they only have 23 years left.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So what's the ask for us today?
That right there.
Can you summarize for the group?
Yeah, so the ask is, do you recommend that the Bend Urban Renewal Agency establish TIF areas to remedy blight and provide assistance to encourage the development of more affordable projects?
I'm assuming none of these can start before 2027 because they would get this funding and then be able to start, so it's a 2 years essentially.
Yeah, so one of the
construction
one of the key requirements of this program is what we heard from the community last year during the MUPTI review. Construction cannot have started. One, it's disadvantage to the developer if they already have, because urban renewal is generated on increment, but also we got a lot of feedback from our community partners and council got the review of MUPTI, and they said that no longer can developments be under construction and be considered for future tax exemptions.
And platform is not included in that.
They're in the second one, but it's different because the first 4 projects will require new TIF districts. Platform is in the core area. And in April, we will actually bring back the proposed TIF plans and reports for you to review and to recommend as well. That way you actually see from start to finish of what actually has to happen with, and it's more educational, but we will also want to get you a recommendation on those official documents as well.
And then I think we talked about like how many applied, just I was curious, are these everybody that applied, or was there some that were?
So we will have one more application round. And then council or borough will get to determine, do they want to pause the program and do a data update? Are we meeting the need? Is the AMI the correct range? Modify the policy and or disband the policy. They have three different options. They could leave it alone, tinker with it, or get rid of it. And they will determine that in October, November.
But this is everybody that applied this round.
Yes, everyone that applied qualified.
Before we get to the motion, I would appreciate, because this is not my area of expertise, those of you that live in this world, any concerns or risks or blind spots?
Oh, no. My computer died.
Oh, so double. I mean, when I looked at it, these projects are not necessarily new projects. I mean, maybe, no, I don't know. They've been around in the works, trying to figure out how to make it happen. Maybe that's too general of a statement, but I think the chart showing the different percentages of AMIs in the need was really helpful, because 90% I was questioning, is that the right bucket? And so that answered my question. I think if there's a big need there, it's gonna help chip away at that. I think those were, yeah.
Yeah, it's all fine. I mean,
No.
they're just projects, and this is just a mechanism to hopefully help get them off the ground essentially. So, I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with the projects themselves. I'm curious about, we're out of time, but what does local contractor mean? Is there did you guys define that somewhere?
We did. So any local business that employs 100 employees or less in the city of Bend.
Yeah, I mean, that was the only other thing that I saw. The two that are like 20% feels like it's not trying hard enough. But I mean, if you're giving money from the city of Bend, it should be city of Bend folks working on it. But
and it's for project costs, right? So we can't.
Yeah, Central Oregon. Sorry.
We said city of Bend.
Which either, yeah, I mean, I think even city of Bend, if it's city of Bend funds, but I think that criteria has already been established, so I didn't know that.
And I'm assuming the same for environmental standards. There are a number of different LEED and Energy Star. There's some matrix of what those are.
Yeah, so. And we'll walk you through, because this is a new one for everyone. In our development agreement with the city, with Bend and the private developer that provides this project, they will have to identify how they are going to comply and then ultimately certify for that enhanced policy. If they don't, they go back to the base.
Jennifer, did you have a question before we get to the motion?
Yeah, I know we're out of time, but and this probably doesn't relate completely, but in the chart, we're looking at about 17% of the proposed housing being at 90% or lower. But the other slide said that 50% of households are unable to afford rent. So what happens to that other 33%? What are we doing to find affordable housing? I understand developers need to make money, and it's a very complicated issue, but I'm just concerned that it may not be aggressive enough to really deal with our housing crisis.
But that's a great question. So last year, the primary goal was to continue building units just flat out, just to get units constructed, and then try to chip away slowly at the affordability. I think that's one of the conversations that Borough will have in the summer and in the fall is, does this policy now need to be more stringent? Does it need to be more targeted? And does it need to be more aggressive in terms of affordability? But the goal last year was just to replace MUPTI, to build units and to try to stabilize the rent, and then work forward about what they want the policy to be.
Thank you.
I can't repeat the motions without them being up on the screen, so.
Do you want me to rewrite it, Jonathan?
If I can remember it correctly.
Computer died, that's
Yeah.
right. Oh, okay, I'm like, why are we?
It's basically, I motion to recommend that BDAB recommends the establishment.
You can be, I move that BDAB recommends the establishment of these two.
new tip areas.
Pressure.
Yeah, no kidding. Attorney sign off?
I think that's the gist.
All right.
And there'll be one,
We'll take
one,
it.
and then there'll be one more motion. I move that BDAB recommends the approval of project platform in the core area.
Do we need to list the 4 in the first one?
As presented by staff is
Okay.
clear enough. Or presented at this meeting is clear enough.
Anything associated with that?
Presented at their March 3rd, 2025 meeting.
I move that BDAB recommends the establishment of the new TIF areas presented at their March 3rd, 2025 meeting. Do
Second,
one at a time, right?
You can do one at a time, yeah.
I'll second that. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay,
Move that BDAB recommends the approval of project platform presented at their March 3rd, 2025 meeting.
I'll second that.
all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Right, motion's carried.
Great. Anything
And
for the good of the order?
Oh, it's electrification.
Are we gonna move agenda items forward? 6. Number
Are you
6.
giving an update? Or you giving
Just-
an-
just 6, yeah, I gotta get out of here.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. We'll adjourn and we'll
We
cover
pick
that
up.
next one.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Wait, what? Blending.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brianna.
Thanks, Brianna.